Clara Whitmore slammed her last coin on that dusty counter and looked the innkeeper dead in the eye. And he laughed at her. Just laughed. Like her desperation was something funny. She had walked 12 miles in broken boots. She had nowhere to sleep. Nobody waiting. Nobody coming. Just a Montana mountain night closing in like a fist. If you've ever been left with nothing, no family, no shelter, no one who would even look at you, stay until the end of this story. Leave your city in the comments below so I can see how far Clara's story has traveled. And if this channel is new to you, subscribe now, because this one is going to stay with you long after it's over. The coin made a small hollow sound when it hit the wooden counter. Clara Whitmore did not flinch. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only invited more cruelty. So she kept her chin level, kept her shoulders square, and she looked at the man behind the counter, the way she had practiced looking at men who held power over her, like she was not afraid, even when every nerve in her body was screaming. "That's all I have," she said. "It's enough for one night." The innkeeper, a wide man with small eyes and a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in months, picked up the coin between two thick fingers. He held it up like he was inspecting something he'd found in the dirt. Then he set it back down on the counter and slid it toward her with one finger. "Ain't enough," he said. "It's a full night's coin for a room in Harrow Falls. I asked the wagon driver." "Wagon driver don't run this establishment." "Sir, I said ain't enough." He crossed his arms over his chest. "And even if it were, I ain't got rooms for women traveling alone. Policy." Clara stared at him. "That is not a policy. That is an excuse." The man's eyes went cold. "You want to stand here and argue with me, or you want to take your coin and find somewhere else to be a problem?" She wanted to argue. God, she wanted to argue. She wanted to plant her feet on that floor and say every true thing that was sitting in her chest like a burning coal. She wanted to tell him that she had spent years having men decide what she was and wasn't worth, and she was finished with it. She wanted to say all of that. But the sun was going down, and she had nowhere to sleep. Clara picked up her coin. She picked up her suitcase, and she walked out of that inn with her back straight and her jaw tight because she would not let him see her break. She would not give him that. The door swung shut behind her, and the cold air of the Montana mountain evening hit her like a warning. She stood on the porch of that inn and looked up and down the main road of the town. They called Ridgeback, a name she had seen on a handmade sign back where the wagon driver had dropped her 3 hours ago. 3 hours ago, when the driver pulled his horses to a stop, set her suitcase in the dust, and said, the ranch she was heading for was another 8 miles up the mountain trail, and he wasn't going that way. "You'll find work in town," he'd said, as if that settled the matter. "Woman like you ought to be able to find something." She had not asked what he meant by a woman like you. She already knew. Ridgeback was not a big town. One main road, a general store, a blacksmith, the inn, a small church with a broken step, a saloon. She had already decided not to enter alone, and a scattering of houses climbing up the hillside. The people here knew each other. They had built this town together, grown up in its soil together, buried their dead in the same cemetery. They were not cruel in the way that Arthur Vance was cruel, deliberate, calculated, patient. They were cruel the way small places could be cruel in the passive sideways manner of people who simply had no room in their understanding for someone who didn't fit. And Clara Whitmore, standing on that inn porch with her single suitcase, and her one coin, and her broken left boot that had been splitting at the sole since she crossed the state line, Clara did not fit. She had known that the moment she'd arrived. She had felt it the way you feel cold water hitting your skin all at once and impossible to ignore. The stares from the women hanging laundry on their lines. The men who looked at her not with interest exactly, but with a calculating sort of attention that made the back of her neck go tight. The young girl in the doorway of the general store who had been told by someone, her mother probably, or an older sister, to go inside when Clara walked past. She walked the length of the main road twice. She went into the general store and asked the owner, a thin man named Dupree, with wire spectacles, whether he knew of any work available. He told her he didn't need help. She asked if he knew anyone who might. He said he couldn't say. She asked if he knew the Caldwell Ranch, the place she had a letter for. He said he knew of it, yes, but that it was a long way up the mountain trail, and not a place for, and then he stopped himself and said it was far was all. She asked two women near the water pump if they knew of any boarding house or family who might take in a woman for the night. One of them looked at her like she had asked something outrageous. The other one said gently, almost apologetically, that she really couldn't say. She asked the man outside the blacksmith shop. He shook his head without even looking at her properly. She tried the church. The pastor, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who seemed genuinely uncomfortable, told her the church didn't have accommodations, and that there was a widow woman named Mrs. Hatch who sometimes took in travelers, but that Mrs. Hatch had gone to visit her daughter in Billings and wouldn't be back until Thursday. It was Monday. Clara thanked him and walked back out. Now she stood on the inn porch, and the sun was going down, and the cold was coming in off the mountain, and she was doing the calculation she had been doing for the last 3 hours, ever since the wagon driver set her down in the dust. She had 1 coin. She had half a sandwich wrapped in cloth in her suitcase left over from the train. She had a letter signed by a man named Caldwell, offering her a position managing the books on his ranch that was 8 miles up a mountain trail she had never walked and could not navigate in the dark. She had a dress that was not warm enough for the night temperature this high in the mountains. She had broken boots. She had been in worse situations. She told herself that. She had survived Arthur Vance. She had survived 2 years of living in a state of controlled fear, of choosing her words carefully, of making herself small and quiet and useful to avoid the kind of anger that had consequences. She had survived packing her suitcase in the dark while Arthur was away, and walking out of that house in Memphis, and getting herself to a train station, and buying a ticket with money. She had saved coin by coin over 18 months. Money she had hidden in the hem of a dress he never looked at twice. She had survived all of that. She could survive this. What she could not do was make herself walk into that saloon. Not alone. Not tonight. She had no illusions about what awaited a woman alone in a saloon in a mountain town on a Monday night. Not danger necessarily. Maybe not even unkindness, but a kind of exposure she couldn't afford. Word traveled in small towns. She needed work here. She needed people to see her as capable, not desperate. Walking into that saloon alone would mark her in a way she couldn't come back from. So she stood on the porch. She watched the sun sink below the western ridge. She watched the lights come on, one by one, in the houses climbing the hillside. She thought about all of those lit windows and the families inside them sitting down to their suppers, and she felt the loneliness of it move through her, the way cold water moves through a crack, finding every weak point, filling every empty space. She had not had a family in a long time. Her mother had died when Clara was 19. Her father had remarried quickly, and his new wife had made it plain in the polite and thorough way of women who know how to use social pressure like a scalpel that Clara was a disruption in the new household. Clara had gone to live with her aunt in Nashville. Her aunt had tried her best, but her aunt was a practical woman, and when Arthur Vance came along, older, established, respected, with a grand house and a position in the community, her aunt had looked at that and looked at Clara's future without it, and said with genuine care and entirely wrong judgment, "This is a good match, Clara. This is security." It was not security. It was a cage with good furniture. She had learned that slowly, and then all at once, the way you learn most terrible things. She was 24 when she married Arthur Vance. She was 27 now, standing on this porch in the Montana mountains, and the 3 years in between had left marks on her that were not visible, but were thorough marks on how she assessed rooms when she entered them. Marks on how she measured the distance between herself and exits, marks on how she braced herself every time a man raised his voice, even in a context that had nothing to do with her. She was not broken. She wanted to be clear about that, even if only to herself, even if only in the quiet inside her own head. She was not broken. She was altered. There was a difference. She was still thinking about the difference when she heard the horses. A group of riders came down the mountain trail at the north end of town. 4 men on horseback moving at the steady, unhurried pace of men who had been in the saddle all day and were finally coming in. They were mountain men, clearly, with that particular kind of ease in the saddle that came from years, not months. They wore the dust of the high country on their coats, and the quiet of it in the way they didn't talk much as they rode. Clara watched them without appearing to watch them, a skill she had perfected. The man at the front was the one her eyes kept returning to. He was tall in the saddle with broad shoulders and a weathered face that was hard to read from a distance. He wore a dark hat pulled low and a coat that had seen years of use. He was older than the others by at least a decade, and he moved through the world with the particular stillness of a man who didn't waste energy on things that didn't matter. How was the kind of man that a town like this pointed to when someone asked who knew these mountains? Clara looked away when the riders reached the far end of the main road. She picked up her suitcase. She needed to decide. Either she walked back to the wagon road and tried to find shelter in the trees, or she found somewhere in this town to sit out the night, or she started up that mountain trail in the dark and hoped she could navigate it by the moon. Miss. The voice was low and even. She turned. The tall man had dismounted. He was standing at the edge of the road holding his horse's reins, looking at her with the direct measuring look of a man who had learned to read situations quickly. He did not look at her the way the innkeeper had looked at her, or the way the men outside the blacksmith shop had looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks when he is actually trying to see something. "You've been standing on that porch a while," he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered quietly. "I'm aware of that," Clara said. He nodded slightly. "Caldwell Ranch up the North Trail," he said. "You're one of the women who applied for the bookkeeping position." She blinked. Then she straightened. "I am. My name is Clara Whitmore. I have a letter." "I know who you are," he said. "I'm Ethan Caldwell." The silence stretched between them for one moment. "You came to get me," she said. "Came into town for supplies," he said. "Figured you might have arrived today. The driver who brings folks up from Bozeman doesn't always take them all the way." He glanced briefly at the inn. "They give you trouble." "Nothing I couldn't manage," Clara said, which was true in the narrow technical sense and completely dishonest in the more important emotional sense. Ethan Caldwell looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at her boots. Then he looked at her suitcase. "You eat today?" he asked. The question surprised her. "I some. Earlier." He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat in a small unconscious gesture. "Ranch is 8 miles. We'll go at first light. Tonight there's supper back at the camp." He nodded toward the north end of town, where his men had set up a small fire in the clearing beyond the last building. "Nothing fancy. Beans and cornbread. You're welcome to it." Clara stared at him. She had been standing on that porch for 2 hours, waiting for something she hadn't known what exactly, only that she was not willing to give up yet. She had asked for help from every person in this town who might conceivably give it, and every single one of them had found a reason to look away. This man had ridden down a mountain trail at the end of a long day and offered her supper. Just supper. Not salvation. Not charity with strings attached. Not pity dressed up in polite language. Just food offered the same way you'd offer it to any person who was standing in the cold at the end of a difficult day. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "But I don't want to impose—" "Miss Whitmore," Ethan Caldwell said, and his voice was patient in the way of a man who didn't like to repeat himself but would do it once. "You're not imposing. You came a long way to work on my ranch. Least I can do is make sure you eat supper." She picked up her suitcase. She walked with him to the fire. The other men, 3 ranch hands named Pete Dutch and a young man of about 20. Everyone called Rabbit looked up when Clara approached. There was a moment of surprise quickly adjusted. Pete, who was oldest, stood up and offered his seat on the log nearest the fire. Dutch nodded. Rabbit stared for a second too long and then looked at the ground. Ethan handed her a tin plate without ceremony and filled it from the pot without being asked. Clara sat down near the fire and ate. She ate the beans and the cornbread, and she drank the coffee that Rabbit shyly poured for her, and she sat in the warmth of that fire, with these men she didn't know, and she felt something she had not felt in so long she'd almost forgotten what to call it. Safe. Not safe because someone was protecting her. Not safe in the dependent, suffocating way she had once confused for security. Safe the way you feel when you're out of the cold, and there's food, and the people around you have no agenda. Safe in the simple, uncomplicated sense of the word. She did not talk much. Neither did the men. The fire cracked. The horses moved quietly at the edge of the firelight. Somewhere up the mountain, something moved through the trees. Deer probably, and all four men tracked the sound without comment, and then let it go. Clara finished her plate. She looked across the fire at Ethan Caldwell, who was drinking his coffee and staring into the middle distance, the way men do when they've been outdoors all day, and the quiet is the only thing they need. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For supper." He considered that for a moment. "That's a small thing to thank someone for." "Not where I've been," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, she would have bristled at pity, but a kind of recognition. Like he heard what she hadn't said. He nodded once. "We ride at first light," he said. "Get some sleep, Miss Whitmore. Tomorrow's a long trail." Clara lay down on the bedroll that Pete silently produced from somewhere and set near the fire, and she looked up at the Montana sky, impossibly wide, blazing with stars. The kind of sky you couldn't see from inside a city or a grand house with curtains on the windows, and she felt the knot in her chest begin very slightly to loosen. She was not saved. She knew that. She had not stumbled into the arms of a rescuer. She had stumbled into supper. But supper on a night like that, at the end of a road, like the one she'd been walking, supper was enough. She closed her eyes. Tomorrow she would see this ranch. Tomorrow she would prove what she was worth. Tonight she slept. She slept better than she had in 3 years. When morning came, it came hard and bright and cold, the way mountain mornings did, sudden and without apology. Clara was awake before the men. She was always awake before anyone now. The habit had taken hold of her during the years with Arthur, when the early morning was the only part of the day that belonged to her entirely, the only hours when she could think without watching for his mood in the air, the way you watch for weather signs. She folded the bedroll neatly and set it where she'd found it. She stirred what remained of the fire and got the coals going enough to heat the leftover coffee. By the time Pete came out from under his blanket, the coffee was hot. He looked at her, then at the coffee, then back at her. "Didn't expect that," he said. "I don't take without giving back," Clara said simply. Pete poured himself a cup. He didn't say anything else, but he looked at her differently after that. Clara noticed. She had learned to notice the small things. Small things were where the truth lived. Ethan came out of his bedroll without fanfare, checked the horses, and had his coffee standing up while he looked at the sky. Clara watched him the way she watched all men now, cataloging, assessing, checking for warning signs. Signs of temper held just below the surface. Signs of the kind of entitlement that didn't announce itself until it needed something. She found none of them. What she found instead was a man who moved through the morning with the same even, unhurried energy he'd brought down the mountain trail the night before. He gave instructions to his men without raising his voice. He listened when Pete said something about one of the horse's shoes. He caught Rabbit nearly knocking over the supply packs and steadied them with one hand, and when Rabbit started to apologize, Ethan just said, "Pay attention," and moved on without making a production of it. He did not perform authority. He simply had it. Clara filed that away. They set out up the north trail as the sun cleared the eastern ridge and turned the mountain grass gold. Clara walked at first, and nobody said anything about it. After about a mile without comment, Ethan brought his horse alongside her and said, "Rabbit's horse can carry double for a stretch. Rabbit'll walk. He's young." "I can walk the trail. 8 miles in those boots," Ethan said, glancing down at her left foot, where the split sole was getting worse. "And you'll be no good for anything tomorrow. I need you functional, Miss Whitmore. I've got 3 years of disorganized records that apparently nobody else could make sense of." He said it matter-of-factly, without kindness or unkindness. Just information. Rabbit. Rabbit scrambled off his horse without argument. Clara mounted. The trail wound up through pines and open meadow, crossing a creek twice on flat stone fords, switchbacking up a ridge where the view opened suddenly, and Clara could see the valley below and the mountain ranges stacked behind one another all the way to the horizon. She had grown up in cities and then suffocated in houses. She had never seen a sky this large in her life. She did not say anything about it. But she felt it, the size of it pressing on something inside her chest that had been compressed for so long she hadn't realized how little room she'd been breathing with. "You from out east?" Pete asked, riding alongside her. "Tennessee originally, Memphis most recently. Long way to come for a bookkeeping job." "Yes," Clara said. Pete didn't push it. She appreciated that. The ranch appeared after they crested the last ridge tucked into a wide mountain valley with a river running through the south end and timber on three sides. It was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something rough and minimal, the kind of operation a solitary man ran from stubbornness. What she found was bigger: a main house, two large outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse, and a corral that held more horses than she had counted expecting. There were several people already moving around the property ranch hands. A woman she later learned was the cook, a boy of about 14, who seemed to have the job of being everywhere at once. It was a working ranch, a real one. Ethan led them down the ridge and into the yard and dismounted at the corral. He handed off his horse to the boy, who he called just son, though Clara would later learn was no relation to him. Just a boy he'd taken on when his family couldn't feed him, and turned to Clara. "Mrs. Greer will show you to the room," he said, nodding toward the woman who had come out of the main house and was now standing on the porch with her arms folded and an expression Clara couldn't entirely read. "When you're settled, I'll show you the records room. I won't pretend it's organized. I'll tell you what I need done, and then I'll leave you to it." "That's all I ask," Clara said. He looked at her for one more of those measured, assessing moments. "You came a long way for this job," he said. "You don't need to prove yourself to me, Miss Whitmore. Just show me what you can do." Clara looked back at him steadily. "That," she said, "is exactly what I intend to do." Ted. Mrs. Greer turned out to be a woman of about 50, with efficient hands and a face that asked questions without actually asking them. She showed Clara to a small room off the main house with a narrow bed and a window that looked out onto the mountains. It was clean. It had a latch on the inside of the door. Clara noticed the latch the way she noticed everything now, with a kind of quiet gratitude she didn't let show on her face. "Breakfast at 6, Mrs. Greer said. "Supper at 7. Mr. Caldwell runs a quiet house. No gambling, no trouble." She paused. "You need anything, you come find me." "I will," Clara said. "Thank you." Mrs. Greer looked at her for a moment with the look of a woman who had seen a great many things and wasn't easily fooled. Then she nodded. "You'll do all right here," she said, as if she were settling something for herself, and went out. Clara set her suitcase on the bed and opened it. She took out the few things she had, the changes of clothes, carefully folded the small leather notebook she wrote in when she needed to think, the photograph of her mother that she had carried for 8 years without letting herself look at too often. She set the photograph on the windowsill and looked at it for a moment. Her mother had been a practical woman. Not cold, but practical, the way women who had survived hard things tended to be practical. She had looked at the world as it was and worked within it, and she had tried to teach Clara to do the same. What she had not been able to teach Clara, because she had died before Clara needed to know, it was how to survive a world that had decided you were worth nothing. Clara had learned that herself. She looked at the mountains out the window. The morning light was moving across them, slow and golden, turning the rock faces amber and the tree lines dark green. She was here. She had made it. Whatever came next, whatever Arthur Vance might try, whatever challenges this ranch would bring, whatever the people in this mountain valley would decide about a woman who had arrived alone with a suitcase and a letter, she was here. And she was not done. She closed the suitcase, splashed water from the basin on her face, and went to find the records room. It was worse than she'd expected. 3 years of ledgers, stacked without system. Supply records mixed in with payroll. Land documents filed under no discernible logic. There were invoices from suppliers she counted twice, and pages that recorded the same transaction in 2 different places with 2 different amounts. She stood in the doorway of the records room and looked at it all and felt for the first time in a long time something that was almost pleasure. This was a problem. She knew how to solve problems. Ethan came in behind her and stood at her shoulder. "I did warn you," he said. "You did," Clara said. "How long has it been since anyone properly managed these?" "Long time." I had a man who did it, but he moved on 3 years back. I've been—" he paused. "Managing. After a fashion." "You've been losing money," Clara said, turning to look at him directly. "I can already see it from here, and I haven't read a single page yet." He did not look offended. He looked like a man who had suspected this, and was now being told he was right. "How bad?" he asked. "I don't know yet. Give me 3 days." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "All right. I'll need a clean table and good light." "Done. And I'll need you to leave me alone in here when I'm working." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a problem, Miss Whitmore." She turned back to the room. 3 days, she said again. She set to work. She worked through the first morning and into the afternoon without stopping, except for the water. Mrs. Greer quietly left outside the door. She built a system from nothing, sorting first by year, then by type, then by date within type. She found errors. She found missing entries. She found a pattern of small overcharges from one supply vendor that went back 18 months, amounting to a sum that made her set down her pen and press her hands flat on the table and breathe. Someone had been stealing from Ethan Caldwell. Not dramatically, not all at once. In the patient, incremental way that only works when nobody is watching the numbers. She picked her pen back up. She kept working. By the time supper came, she had finished the first year and begun the second, and had 3 pages of notes in her neat, precise hand. She came to the table in the main house, which she had not done before eating her meals in the records room, and sat in the chair that Mrs. Greer pointed her to. Ethan sat at the head. The 3 hands who lived on the ranch sat along the other side. There was a younger man she hadn't met yet, introduced briefly as Sam, who managed the horses. Nobody said much. That was fine. Clara had spent enough of her life filling silences for men who found silence uncomfortable. She ate her supper, a proper supper: roasted meat and potatoes and bread, still warm from the oven. And she listened to the way this household moved, the way the men spoke to each other and to Ethan, and she learned more in that half hour than she could have in a week of asking questions. Ethan Caldwell ran a fair house. She had been in enough houses to know that was not a small thing. After supper, when the others had gone, Clara remained at the table. Ethan was pouring coffee. He glanced at her. "You don't have to stay up," he said. "I have something to tell you," she said. "About the records." He sat down across from her with his coffee. She put her 3 pages of notes on the table. She told him about the vendor. She told him the total. She told him how it had been done and how long it had been happening, and what she believed the full extent of the loss was. Ethan listened without interrupting. He looked at the notes. He picked up the pages and read through them. When he put them back down, his face was very still. "How sure are you?" he said. "Not completely. I need another 2 days to confirm the full amount. But the pattern is clear. It's not a mistake." "No," he said slowly. "It isn't." He was quiet for a moment. "The vendor's name is Glendon." "Yes." "He's been supplying this ranch for 6 years." "I know. The overcharging started 3 years ago, when your previous bookkeeper left." A long silence. "Miss Whitmore," Ethan said finally, and his voice was careful in the way of a man choosing his words. "I brought you here to manage records. I didn't expect you to walk in and find something like this in 3 days." "You didn't ask me to look for it," Clara said. "But it was there." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It was." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you want to do about it? What would you suggest?" She had already thought about this. "Confirmation first. I need all the numbers solid before you take any action. Then you bring it to the territorial office with documentation. You don't confront Glendon directly. He'll deny it and destroy whatever records he keeps. You go through proper channels with everything I put together for you, and you let the law handle it." Ethan was quiet. "You've thought this through." "I've had some experience," Clara said, "with situations where a person with more power than you decides you're a problem to be managed. The most effective thing you can do is to make your case so solid they can't find a way around it." Something moved across Ethan's face. He didn't ask what she meant by that. Maybe he understood. Maybe he simply knew better than to push. All right, he said. 2 more days, then we'll see what you've got. He stood. He picked up his coffee cup. He looked at her once more in that measuring, direct way he had, the way that didn't feel like judgment, only like attention. You should sleep, he said. Early morning tomorrow. I know, she said. Good night, Mr. Caldwell? He nodded. Good night, Miss Whitmore. He went out. Clara sat at the table alone for another minute. She looked at her notes. She looked at the door he'd gone through. She thought about the woman who had stood on that inn porch last night, calculating how she was going to survive a mountain night with no shelter, 1 coin, and broken boots. She thought about the supper he'd offered her without making her beg for it. She thought about what he'd said on the trail. You don't need to prove yourself to me. Just show me what you can do. She thought about how long it had been since someone had said something like that to her. She picked up her notes and went to the records room. She worked for another 2 hours. Outside, the Montana mountains stood dark and massive against a sky full of stars. And somewhere in the valley below, a river moved over stones in the dark, and the ranch slept around her, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived here with nothing and no one, sat in a lit room and did the work that would begin to change everything. She was not rescued. She was not saved. She was simply finally in a place where what she did with her hands and her mind and her stubborn, unbroken will could matter. That was enough. For now, that was everything. 2 days later, Clara had her numbers. She had not slept more than 4 hours either night. She had worked by lamplight until her eyes ached and her fingers cramped from writing, and she had checked every figure twice, and then a third time, because she did not make mistakes. She couldn't defend. And what she had found was serious enough that she needed to be absolutely certain before she said another word about it. The total was worse than she'd first estimated. Glendon, the supply vendor, who had been serving the Caldwell Ranch for 6 years, had overcharged on invoices in amounts small enough to avoid immediate notice, but consistent enough over 3 years, to amount to something that made Clara sit back in her chair and press her hands flat on the table and look at the ceiling and just breathe for a moment. It wasn't catastrophic. The ranch was solvent. Clearly, Ethan ran too tight an operation for one crooked vendor to sink it. But the amount was significant. Significant enough to matter. Significant enough to be deliberate. She brought everything to Ethan at breakfast. She set the pages on the table beside his coffee cup and sat across from him and waited while he read. He read slowly. He turned each page deliberately, the way a man reads something he knows he's only going to read once and needs to understand completely. The other men had already gone out to start the morning work. Mrs. Greer was somewhere in the back of the house. It was just the two of them, and the sound of the fire and the papers between them. When he finished, he set the last page down. He didn't say anything for a moment. 3 years, he said finally. Yes. Every invoice. Not every one. He was careful. He skipped enough to make the pattern non-obvious. If you didn't look at the full body of records together, you wouldn't see it. You'd just see normal variation in pricing. Ethan picked up his coffee cup. He looked at it rather than at her. I trusted that man. I know. He ate supper at this table. I know, Clara said again more quietly. Another silence. You're sure? Ethan said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the kind of thing you said when you wanted the other person to give you room to doubt, because the truth was uncomfortable and doubt was easier. I'm sure, Clara said. She didn't give him room. She had learned that giving men room to doubt something true didn't serve anyone in the long run. I went back through every invoice cross-referenced with delivery records and the original quoted prices from the contracts he signed with your father. The overcharging began within 4 months of your previous bookkeeper leaving. It stopped once for about 3 months, then resumed at a slightly higher rate. It is not a mistake. Ethan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, What do we do? Clara had been ready for this question since 2 in the morning. We document everything formally. I put together a complete accounting, every overcharged invoice, the original contract price versus what was charged, the cumulative total, and a timeline that shows the pattern clearly. Then you take it to the Territorial Land and Commerce Office in Harrow Falls. Not the local constable. This crosses enough dollar amounts to be a territorial matter. You present the documentation, you file a formal complaint, and you let the process work. That process takes time. Yes. Glendon will know something is happening. Yes. Which is why you don't tell him anything before you file. You continue ordering supplies as normal. You pay his next invoice at the incorrect price, and you document that payment too. Then you file. She paused. The worst thing you can do is confront him before you have the legal process started. He'll have time to change his records. Ethan looked at her across the table. You've thought about this like someone who's dealt with it before. It was the second time he had said something like that. The second time he'd come close to asking about her past without asking directly. Clara met his eyes. I've dealt with men who believed they could take what they wanted because nobody was paying close enough attention, she said. The only way to stop that kind of man is to pay very close attention and then make your case so tight he can't argue his way out of it. The silence between them was different now. Heavier. Not uncomfortable, just full, the way silences get when two people are both thinking about something they haven't said. All right, Ethan said. We do it your way. I'll have the formal documentation ready by end of day. He nodded. He stood. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door. Then he stopped with his hand on the doorframe and looked back at her. Miss Whitmore, he said. Yes. You've been here 3 days. I have. He seemed to weigh something. You've already done more than the last 2 men I hired for this position in a combined year. Clara didn't let herself react to that. She had learned not to let compliments move her too quickly. She'd had compliments from Arthur too in the beginning, and she knew now what compliments sometimes preceded. I'm doing the job I came here to do. I know that, Ethan said. I just wanted to say it. And he went out. Clara sat at the table alone for a moment. She was aware that her heart was doing something quiet and inconvenient, and she set that aside firmly and went back to the records room. She had documentation to finish. She was halfway through it when Rabbit knocked on the records room door with a nervousness that was almost visible from the hallway. There's a man here, he said. Rode up about 10 minutes ago. He's asking for... He stopped, swallowed. He says he's looking for a woman named Clara Whitmore. The pen in Clara's hand went still. She set it down carefully. She put her hands flat on the table. She breathed. What does he look like? She said, and her voice was perfectly even, and she was proud of that because her heart had just dropped through the floor. Older man. Fancy coat, nice horse. Came with another fella, doesn't say much. The older one does all the talking. He's... Rabbit hesitated. He's real polite. That kind of polite that feels like a wall. Clara knew exactly that kind of polite. Where is he? She said. Ethan's got him in the yard. Said you weren't to be fetched until you were ready. Rabbit looked at her with the straightforward concern of a 20-year-old who didn't yet know how to conceal what he felt. You okay, Miss Whitmore? I'm fine, she said. She stood. She smoothed her dress. She picked up the 3 most important pages of documentation she had completed and folded them and put them in her pocket because she did not know what was about to happen, and she had learned to keep her most important things close to her body. Tell Mr. Caldwell I'm coming. She walked out of the records room. She walked through the main house. She walked out the front door. And there he was. Arthur Vance stood in the yard of Ethan Caldwell's ranch, looking exactly as he always looked. Unhurried, impeccable, with an expression of patient authority that he wore the way other men wore coats. He was 53 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that photographed well and read as distinguished until you'd spent enough time looking at it to see what lived underneath. Clara had spent 3 years looking at it. She knew what lived underneath. Beside him was a man she recognized, Burl Hatch, who served as Arthur's personal errand man, a thick-set, quiet person whose job it was to be present in situations where presence communicated a kind of threat that words didn't need to carry. Ethan stood between them and the house. He was not touching his gun. He was not raising his voice. He was simply standing there, arms loose at his sides, looking at Arthur Vance with the particular stillness of a man who had already decided how this was going to go. Arthur saw Clara come out of the house, and his expression shifted, not dramatically, Just a small adjustment, like a man recalculating a route. "Clara," he said. "Mr. Vance," she said. "You've led me on quite a journey." He smiled. It was a practiced smile. "I was worried about you." "Were you?" "Deeply." He looked around the yard with the measuring eye of a man assessing property. "Mr. Caldwell was kind enough to speak with me while I waited. I've explained the situation to him." "And what situation is that?" Clara said. "That you've been through a difficult time. That you left Memphis in a state of confusion. That there are matters between us that need to be resolved in a civilized manner." He paused. "And that you are currently in violation of a contractual agreement, which makes your presence here under the terms I've filed with the county technically." "There is no contract," Clara said. Arthur's smile didn't waver. "The documents I have say otherwise." "The documents you have," Clara said, "are based on an arrangement my aunt entered into without understanding what she was signing under pressure from your legal representative. In a context she believed was a standard employment agreement and was not. I have copies of the original correspondence, Mr. Vance. I have been very careful about what I kept." She had not told him she had the correspondence. She had carried those letters all the way from Memphis in the lining of her suitcase, and she had not mentioned them to anyone, because she had known since the day she left that this moment was coming. Arthur looked at her. For just 1 second, behind the practiced pleasantness, she saw the calculation. The reassessment. "Clara," he said in a different tone, now lower, more personal, the tone he used when he wanted to remind her of the version of herself she'd been in his house. "Let's not do this in front of strangers. Come home with me. We'll resolve this privately." "No," Clara said. Just that. Just no. She had said it before in her own mind 100 times. She had said it to herself in the dark of early morning in his house when she was planning her escape, and she needed to practice the shape of refusal. She had said it quietly. She had said it carefully. She had wrapped it in other words to make it easier for everyone. Today, she said it clean. Arthur went still. It was a small, controlled stillness, the kind that in his house had always preceded something. But they were not in his house. Ethan said very quietly from where he was standing between them, "Miss Whitmore has told you no." Arthur looked at Ethan for a long moment. He did the calculation that men like Arthur always did: size, likelihood of violence, social cost, legal recourse. "I have legal documents," Arthur said. "Then you'll want to file them with the appropriate office," Ethan said. "This is private property. Miss Whitmore works here. She's asked you to leave." "She hasn't asked me." "I'm asking you," Ethan said. Not loud, not aggressive, just absolute. Burl Hatch shifted his weight slightly. Ethan didn't look at him. He kept looking at Arthur. And Arthur, who was above all things, a practical man, read the room. "I'll be in Harrow Falls," he said to Clara. He made his voice sound reasonable, even kind, because that was the most threatening thing available to him right now, and he knew it. "When you've had time to think clearly, I hope you'll come and see me." "I won't," Clara said. He turned his horse. Burl followed. They rode out of the yard. Clara stood where she was until she couldn't hear the horses anymore. Then her knees tried to go soft, and she locked them hard because she was not going to crumble in the yard. She heard Ethan's boots on the ground as he walked toward her. "He's staying in Harrow Falls," she said before Ethan could say anything. Her voice was steady. She had decided it would be steady. "He won't leave. He came this far, he won't leave without what he came for." "What did he come for?" Ethan asked. "He came for me, not because he wants me. He doesn't, he never did. He came because I left, because I chose to leave." She turned to look at Ethan directly. To men like Arthur Vance, being left by someone he considered his property is an insult he cannot absorb. He'll use every legal mechanism available to him, and if those fail, he'll find other methods. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "The contract," he mentioned. "It's constructed on a false basis. I can prove it. But proving it requires getting the documentation I have in front of someone with the authority to act on it." Ethan looked at her steadily. "The territorial office." "Yes." "The same place you want to take the Glendon documentation?" "Yes," Clara said. He was quiet. She could see him working through it, the complications, the logistics, the risks. She let him work. She didn't rush him. "You were already planning to fight this," he said finally, before he showed up. "I've been planning to fight it since Memphis," Clara said. "I just needed to get somewhere I could do it from." Something moved across Ethan's face. It wasn't pity. She would have stepped back from pity. It was something more considered, something that looked more like respect. "How much danger are you in?" he asked directly. She appreciated the directness. She matched it. "Arthur is not a violent man, not physically. His weapons are legal, social, and financial. But the man with him, Burl Hatch, has been known to take more direct approaches to problems Arthur finds inconvenient." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then you won't walk to town alone." "I wasn't planning to. And we go to the territorial office sooner rather than later." "That was also my plan." He looked at her for another long moment. She couldn't read all of what was in his expression, and she'd stopped trying to read men's expressions completely. Arthur had taught her that expressions could be performed, but there was something in Ethan's face that was consistent she'd noticed over the past 3 days. Something that didn't change based on who was watching or what he needed from the moment. Whatever it was real. "Go finish your documentation," he said. "I'll talk to Pete. We ride to Harrow Falls day after tomorrow." "I'll be ready," Clara said. She went back inside. She walked to the records room and sat down and picked up her pen. Her hands were perfectly steady. She was faintly amazed by her own hands. She looked at them for a moment, the ink stains on her first 2 fingers, the small scar on her left thumb from a kitchen accident 3 years ago in Arthur's house, the plain, unadorned look of hands that worked, and she felt something move through her that she couldn't entirely name. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to the feeling of standing on solid ground and knowing that the ground would hold. She went back to work. The next day passed in a kind of coiled quiet. The ranch went about its business, the horses, the cattle, the repairs and the morning work and the evening routines, but everyone could feel it. Rabbit was jumpier than usual. Pete kept glancing toward the south trail when he thought nobody was looking. Even Mrs. Greer moved through the kitchen with a slightly more deliberate efficiency, the way a woman moves when she's thinking hard about something she's not saying. Clara spent the day completing her documentation. She organized everything into 2 separate packets, one for the Glendon matter, one for the Arthur Vance situation, each with a cover page summarizing the key facts, each with all supporting documents arranged in order, each with her signature and the date, and a clear statement of what the evidence demonstrated. She had done this kind of work before, in a different context, under different circumstances. She had organized Arthur's business papers in the early years before he realized she was too good at it and moved her away from anything that mattered. She had not understood then what she was learning. She understood now, in the afternoon. Ethan came to the records room doorway and stood there for a moment without speaking. "Something wrong," Clara said without looking up. "Got a message from town," he said. "Vance has spoken with Judge Prentice." Clara's pen stopped. She looked up. "Prentice is in Harrow Falls." "Apparently. He comes through on circuit every 3 months. Vance got to him before we even knew he was here." Clara set her pen down. "What did Prentice say?" "Vance is claiming he has a contract that entitles him to—" Ethan's voice went slightly flat on the next word. "Return of absconded property. Prentice is holding a hearing. Day after tomorrow." "Day after tomorrow," Clara repeated. "The same day we plan to go to the territorial office." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She breathed. She looked at the documentation on the table in front of her, weeks of work compressed into 3 days. Every number checked twice, every argument supported. "Is Prentice a fair man?" she asked. A pause. "He's a complicated man." "That's not the same thing." "No," Ethan agreed. "It isn't." Clara looked at her papers. She looked at the window. She looked back at Ethan. "Vance planned this," she said. "He knew Prentice was on circuit. He arrived when he did deliberately. He wanted to get to the judge before I could get to the territorial office, because the territorial office has more authority, and he can't manage them the way he can manage a circuit judge." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. That would mean he had more information about your situation and your plans than I'd expect him to have. The thought landed cold. Yes, it would. Clara looked at the door, at the house beyond it, at the ranch she had been in for 4 days. Who in Harrow Falls knew I was here? The men in town saw us ride out together. Dupree at the general store knows I was looking for a bookkeeper. And, Ethan stopped. And, Clara said. Glendon makes his supply runs through Harrow Falls, Ethan said quietly. He's got connections. He knows people. The two situations locked together in Clara's mind, with a click she could almost hear. Glendon and Vance, she said slowly. Do you know if they know each other? Ethan was very still. I don't know, but Harrow Falls is not a big territory. If Glendon knew I was here and what I was doing, Clara started, he'd want me dealing with something else before I could take the Glendon matter to the territorial office. Ethan finished. They looked at each other. That's a considerable coincidence otherwise, Clara said. Yes, Ethan said. It is. The fire in the hearth down the hallway cracked and settled. Outside, one of the horses moved in the corral. The ranch went on around them quiet and working. And inside the records room, two people were understanding that what Clara had walked into was not simply a job, and what Ethan was dealing with was not simply a crooked vendor. The hearing is the day after tomorrow, Clara said. Can we get to the territorial office before then? It's a full day's ride to the territorial office from here. The hearing is in Harrow Falls, which is 8 miles down the mountain. We can't do both in time. Then we go to the hearing, Clara said. We go to the hearing with everything I have, and we make the case there. Prentice may not be fair, I know. She folded her hands on the table. But I'd rather be in that room making the argument than waiting on the outside hoping it goes my way. I have never gotten anything by hoping. Ethan looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, or maybe she had seen it and hadn't known what to call it. A kind of careful attention that was also something warmer. Not soft. Nothing about Ethan Caldwell was soft but human, in a way she was only beginning to measure. You're not afraid, he said. I didn't say that, Clara said. You're not acting afraid. Acting afraid, she said, has never helped me, not once. I was quiet. Then, all right, we go to the hearing. We go to the hearing, she agreed. That night at supper, Clara sat at the table and ate and listened and watched the people around her the way she had learned to watch. Pete was solid and dependable. Dutch was quieter lately. She noticed he'd been quieter since Arthur's visit, and she filed that away without drawing conclusions. Rabbit kept looking at her with barely concealed anxious loyalty that she found unexpectedly touching. Sam talked about a horse with a stone bruise in a tone that made it clear the horse's welfare was a personal matter. Mrs. Greer put more bread on the table than usual, which Clara was beginning to understand was her way of expressing concern, and Ethan sat at the head of the table and said almost nothing, which she was beginning to understand was not unusual, but that tonight had a different quality, a watchfulness directed outward toward the windows and the door that he was working to make look like ordinary quiet. He was worried, not about himself. She was becoming sure of that. After supper, when the others had gone, Clara stayed. She did not plan to stay. She had planned to go back to the records room and do one final check of everything, but she stayed. Ethan was at the window with his coffee. Tell me about the judge, she said. He turned. He seemed unsurprised she was still there. Prentice is a circuit judge who's been in this territory for 8 years, he said. He's not stupid. He's not entirely corrupt. But he's a man who values social order above most things, and his understanding of social order is, he paused, traditional. Meaning he'll look at a woman who left her husband. He won't call it that, Ethan said. Vance won't either. They'll frame it as a business contract, a contractual obligation, something that has nothing to do with your personal situation. Because framing it as a personal situation would require them to acknowledge what the personal situation was, Clara said. Yes. She was quiet. And if Prentice rules in Vance's favor, Ethan set his coffee cup down on the window ledge. He turned to look at her fully. Then we take it to the territorial court. There's a higher authority than Prentice. It takes longer. It costs more. And in the meantime, he stopped. In the meantime what? In the meantime, Vance could push for a ruling that limits your movement pending the appeal. Clara absorbed this. He could try to confine me here, or require you to return to a holding point until the matter is settled, which would be his advantage, because the longer this takes, the more it costs, and he has substantially more money than... She stopped herself. Than I do, she had been about to say. Which was true. She had almost nothing. She had her suitcase, her documentation, and the salary she hadn't yet received for 3 days of work. Then either of us, Ethan said, finishing her sentence in a direction she hadn't expected. She looked at him. You don't have to. The man who's been stealing from my ranch for 3 years has apparently been working with the man who's been trying to use a false contract to keep you trapped, Ethan said. His voice was very even. That makes this my matter as much as yours. She was quiet. Miss Whitmore, Ethan said, and his tone shifted slightly, careful in the way of a man saying something he's thought about and not entirely sure how to say. I don't know what you've been through. You've been careful not to tell me and I haven't pushed. But I've been watching you work for 4 days, and I know how a person moves when they've been surviving under pressure for a long time. I know what that looks like, and I want you to know. He stopped. Tried again. You don't have to do this alone. You're not doing it alone. Clara sat with that for a moment. She had learned over 3 years of very careful living not to trust offers of help without understanding what they cost. Not to accept alliances without reading the terms. Not to let someone stand beside her without first understanding what they expected in return. She looked at Ethan Caldwell, this man who had offered her supper without asking anything for it, who had looked at her documentation and said, "Do it your way," who had stepped between her and Arthur Vance, not as her owner or her savior, but simply as a person standing beside another person who needed someone standing beside them, and she did something she had not done in a long time. She decided to trust him. Not blindly, not completely, not without continuing to watch. But enough. All right, she said. All right, he repeated, and something in his face settled. I want to go over the documentation with you tonight, she said. Both packets. I want you to understand every piece of it before we walk into that room. Then let's get to it. They worked until almost midnight. Clara walked Ethan through every invoice, every discrepancy, every piece of evidence she had assembled for both the Glendon matter and the Vance situation. Ethan was a better audience than she had expected. He asked specific questions. He caught one error she had made in her own notes and pointed to it without making a production of it. And he read everything she gave him with the same focused attention he seemed to give everything. He did not pretend to understand things he didn't. He did not perform confidence. He simply worked beside her. At some point, Mrs. Greer came in, left a pot of coffee and a plate of bread and cold meat, and went back to bed without a word. At some point, Pete knocked on the door, looked in, looked at the two of them at the table covered in papers, nodded, and went away. By midnight, they had been through everything twice. You have a strong case, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. If Prentice is willing to look at it. He'll look at it. Whether he sees it is another matter. Then we make sure it's impossible to unsee. Ethan looked at her across the table. The lamp was burning low. Outside, the mountain night was deep and still. She was tired, genuinely tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had been running on will and necessity for a long time. But she was also underneath the tiredness, something that felt almost electric. She was going to fight, not run, not negotiate, not make herself small and quiet and hope for the best. She was going to walk into that room day after tomorrow with everything she had built, and she was going to make her case, and she was going to make it impossible to look away. You should sleep, Ethan said. I know. We ride early. I know that too. He stood. He gathered his hat. He looked at her one more time with that expression. She was still learning the language of steady, attentive something underneath that. He didn't put into words. You're the most capable person I've had in this house in a long time, he said. It came out quietly, like he hadn't entirely planned to say it. Clara felt something move in her chest, and she was careful about it, the way you're careful about a fire that could warm you or burn you, depending on how close you stood. "Good night, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "Good night, Miss Whitmore." He went out. She sat at the table for one more minute. She looked at the documentation, everything she had built, everything she had saved, everything she had refused to let Arthur Vance take from her by getting away first. She looked at the empty chair where Ethan had been sitting. She thought about the word alongside. She thought about what it felt like to have someone standing there. Then she picked up the lamp and went to bed. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room with the latch on the inside of the door, and she looked at the ceiling, and she thought, not about Arthur, not about the hearing, not about the documentation, or the ride tomorrow, or any of the 100 things that could go wrong. She thought about the first night 3 days ago when she had eaten beans and cornbread by a fire with men she didn't know, and felt for the first time in 3 years the thing she hadn't known she was still looking for: safe. She thought about what Ethan had said tonight. "You're not doing it alone." She had been alone for so long that the word alone had stopped feeling like a condition and started feeling like just the way things were, like gravity, like weather, like something that simply was the case, and there was no use thinking about otherwise. She pulled the blanket up. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountains stood in the dark, enormous and indifferent, and somehow in this place, not hostile. Just there, just real, just the world as it was before anyone tried to make it into something smaller. Tomorrow they would ride. The day after they would fight. Tonight, just for these hours, Clara Whitmore slept in a room with a latch on the door and the quiet of the mountains outside, and the knowledge, fragile and new and real, that somewhere in this house was a man who had said, "You are not doing this alone," and meant it. They rode before sunrise. Clara had been awake before the horses were saddled, sitting on the edge of her bed in the dark, with her documentation packet in her lap, going through it one final time in her head. Not reading it, she had it memorized by now, just feeling the weight of it. Making sure it was real. Making sure she hadn't built a case out of hope instead of evidence. It was real. She dressed, pinned her hair, and was standing in the yard with her packet under her arm when Ethan came out of the main house. He looked at her already there, and something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. It wasn't a question. "I slept," Clara said. "I just finished early." Pete and Dutch were already seeing to the horses. Rabbit was not coming. Ethan had decided 2 nights ago that someone needed to stay at the ranch, and he had put Pete in charge of that, but Pete had argued himself onto the riding party, and so it was Dutch who stayed behind with Rabbit and Sam, with instructions that were specific enough that Clara understood Ethan was not operating under the assumption that Arthur Vance played by any rules that could be taken for granted. "If Hatch comes back while we're gone," Ethan had said to Dutch the evening before standing by the corral gate, "you send Rabbit up the north trail for the Hendersons. You don't engage, you just get more people here." Dutch had nodded. He was not a man who needed things explained twice. Now they rode down the mountain trail in the thin gray light before dawn. Ethan, Clara, and Pete, and the only sound was the horses' hooves on the packed earth, and the birds beginning somewhere in the trees above them, and Clara held her packet against her chest, and breathed the cold mountain air, and tried to feel like a woman walking into a room to fight, not a woman walking toward the thing she was afraid of. The distinction mattered. The thing she was afraid of, and the thing she was walking toward, were the same thing. She had always known that, but how you named it changed how you carried it. She was walking toward the fight. "Prentice arrives at 8, Ethan said without looking at her. "Hearing is scheduled for 10. That gives us 2 hours to speak with him before Vance does." "Has he already spoken with him?" "Yesterday, according to the message I got. But a judge who's made up his mind before the hearing is a judge who's broken the rules of his own office. I want to establish that we know that before we sit down." Clara looked at him. "You've thought about this?" "I've been thinking about it since you showed me those papers," Ethan said. "Vance didn't come up here on a social call. He came up here because he's been planning this since before you left Memphis." "Yes. Which means he had someone watching you." "Yes," Clara said again more quietly. "I suspected that." In the last year, Arthur had a kind of awareness of where I was and what I was doing that went beyond what was normal. I assumed it was his household staff reporting to him. I was careful. I moved only when I was certain I wasn't being observed. But you weren't certain enough, Pete said from behind them. He didn't say it as a criticism, just as the fact it was. No, Clara said. Apparently not. They reached Harrow Falls as the sun was clearing the eastern ridge and the town was beginning its morning. The general store unlocking the blacksmith's fire, starting two women crossing the main road with baskets. Clara noticed them notice her, and she felt the same thing she'd felt 4 days ago when she arrived here. The sideways glance, the assessment, the quiet closing of ranks that small places did when something unfamiliar appeared. Today, she didn't have time to feel it. Ethan took them directly to the building where Circuit Court was held, a large room at the back of the town's civic building, normally used for public meetings converted on court days to something that resembled a proper hearing room. A man at the front desk looked up when they came in. "Judge Prentice," Ethan said. "Is he in?" "He arrived this morning," the man said cautiously. "He's not seeing anyone until—" "Tell him Ethan Caldwell is here," Ethan said, "and that I have evidence relevant to the hearing he's scheduled for 10 o'clock. The man looked at him, then at Clara, then back at Ethan. "Wait here," he said, and went through a door at the back. They waited. Clara stood with her packet, and her straight back, and her carefully calibrated expression. Pete stood near the door with his arms folded. Ethan stood at Clara's left shoulder, and did not fidget, and did not look around the room, and did not do anything except exist in that particular quality of stillness he had that made the space around him feel deliberate. The man came back. "He'll see Mr. Caldwell," he said. "Miss Whitmore comes with me," Ethan said immediately. "She's the relevant party in the hearing and has documentation the judge needs to review." A brief hesitation. He said, "She comes with me," Ethan said again. Same tone, same volume. Not a repetition, a statement of the way things were going to be. The man looked at Clara, then at Ethan. Then he stepped aside. Judge Prentice was a man of about 60, with white hair and a face that had been lived in hard. He was sitting behind a plain wooden table with papers in front of him and reading spectacles on his nose, and he looked at them over the spectacles when they came in with the expression of a man whose morning had just become more complicated than he preferred. "Caldwell," he said. He looked at Clara. He did not say her name. "Judge," Ethan said, "this is Clara Whitmore. She's been employed at my ranch for the past 4 days, and she has documentation I believe the court needs to review before this morning's hearing." Prentice looked at Clara for a long moment. His expression was, as Ethan had said, complicated. Not hostile, not friendly. Calculating in the way of a man who was used to managing situations by understanding all the angles first. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally, "I've been told a certain version of your situation." "I'd like to offer you a different version," Clara said, "with documentation to support it." He was quiet for a moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat. She opened her packet. She placed the first page on the table and slid it across to him. She had decided the night before how she was going to do this. Not emotionally. Not with the personal history, not yet. She was going to lead with the legal argument, with the documented evidence, with the precise and provable and irrefutable facts, because Prentice was the kind of man who would be moved by evidence before he was moved by anything else. She was going to be exactly what she had taught herself to be in 2 years of careful survival, precise, controlled, and impossible to dismiss. "The contract Mr. Vance claims entitles him to my return was signed by my maternal aunt, Mrs. Ruth Langley, in December of 1881, Clara said. At the time of signing, Mrs. Langley was told the document was a standard employment agreement for domestic services. She was not represented by legal counsel. The man who presented the document to her was Mr. Vance's attorney, who did not disclose his representation of Mr. Vance when he met with Mrs. Langley." She placed the second page. "This is a copy of the original letter sent to Mrs. Langley before the meeting, signed by Mr. Vance's attorney under a business name that did not disclose his connection to Mr. Vance. And this third page is a copy of a subsequent letter from Mrs. Langley to a friend in which she describes what she was told the document contained which does not match the document Mr. Vance will present to you today." Prentice picked up each page. He read. The room was very quiet. "You carried these from Memphis," he said. "I carried them from Memphis in the lining of my suitcase," Clara said. "I removed them, and I brought them here today because I knew this hearing was coming, and I knew these documents were the only thing standing between me and a ruling that would be based on false premises." Prentice set the pages down. He looked at her over his spectacles. The contract itself, even if the circumstances of signing were irregular, may still carry legal weight depending on the specific language. "The specific language," Clara said, "includes a clause that references services of a personal nature which I would invite the court to define clearly, because Mr. Vance's interpretation of that clause has not, in my 3 years of experience, aligned with any professional definition of personal services I'm aware of." Something shifted in Prentice's face. Just slightly. Just enough. Ethan beside her said nothing. He had told her the night before that he would let her lead in the hearing room. She had told him that was the right call. He had agreed without needing to be convinced, which she had noted. "There's also the matter of duress," Clara said. She placed the 4th page. "This is an account in my own hand of specific incidents during the period of my residence with Mr. Vance, dated and detailed. I recognize that my own account carries less legal weight than corroborating testimony, and I have witnesses I can provide if the court requires them. But I offer it today as a preliminary record." Prentice read the 4th page. He read it slowly. When he looked up, something had changed in his expression. Not dramatically. He was too practiced for dramatic shifts. But something. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "did Mr. Vance's attorney advise you of your right to independent legal representation before you signed any documents in his household?" "No document I signed in Mr. Vance's household was presented to me as a legal document," Clara said. "They were presented as household records, administrative matters." Prentice set the page down. He took his spectacles off. He looked at the table for a moment. "I'll need the morning," he said. "The hearing will proceed at 10 as scheduled, but I intend to review these documents fully before then." He looked at Ethan. "Mr. Caldwell, I expect you and Miss Whitmore to be present at 10. "We will be," Ethan said. They walked out. In the hallway, Pete looked at Clara's face and read something there that made him exhale slowly. "How did it go?" he said. "He's reading the documentation," Clara said. "Is that good?" "It means he hasn't decided yet," Clara said, "which is better than the alternative." They had 2 hours. Ethan suggested they get breakfast at the small eating house on the far end of the main road. Clara agreed, not because she was hungry. Her stomach was too tight for hunger, but because sitting somewhere warm with coffee was better than standing in a courthouse hallway, managing her nerves through willpower alone. The eating house was nearly empty at this hour. A man in the corner looked up when they came in, registered Ethan, and looked away. The woman behind the counter, stout and brisk, brought coffee without being asked and took their order without making conversation, which Clara appreciated. Prentice was listening, Ethan said after the coffee came. "He was reading," Clara said. "There's a difference." "He took his spectacles off," Pete said, wrapping both hands around his mug. "Man only takes his spectacles off when something's got his attention proper." Clara looked at Pete. "You know him. Know of him. Grew up in this territory. Prentice has been circuiting through here since I was a young man. He's—" Pete thought about it. "He's not a bad man. He's a man who spent 40 years in legal proceedings where the outcome was mostly determined before he arrived, and it's made him practical about what he can and can't change. But if you give him something he can't look past—" Pete shrugged. "He'll look at it." "She gave him something he can't look past," Ethan said. And he said it not to Clara, but to Pete in the tone of a man stating a fact. And Clara sat with that for a moment and felt something move in her chest, that she was becoming more familiar with that careful, fragile warmth she kept treating like something that might break if she looked at it too directly. She drank her coffee. At 9:30 they walked back toward the courthouse. They were halfway down the main road when Clara saw Arthur Vance. He was standing outside the general store with Burl Hatch and a third man she didn't recognize, younger, sharp-faced, carrying a satchel that meant legal papers. Arthur's attorney. He had brought his attorney from Memphis. He had planned this precisely, timed this exactly, and invested considerably in making sure it worked. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Arthur smiled that practiced pleasant smile and touched the brim of his hat. Clara did not smile back. She did not acknowledge the hat touch. She looked at him for exactly 2 seconds, which was long enough to let him know she had seen him and was not afraid of being seen, and then she looked forward and kept walking. Ethan beside her did not say anything, but his pace matched hers exactly. They got to the courthouse at 9:45. Arthur and his party arrived at 9:50. They sat on opposite sides of the room. The civilian seating area filled quickly. Apparently a hearing in Harrow Falls was a notable event, and people had heard about it, because Clara counted 11 people settling into the rows of chairs who had no obvious connection to either party. Small towns, she thought. They watched everything. Arthur's attorney, introduced for the record as Mr. Dalton of Memphis, arranged his papers with efficient confidence. He was young, well-dressed, and had the particular ease of a man who believed the outcome of this morning was already settled. Clara kept her documentation in her lap, and her hands folded over it, and her expression neutral. At 10 o'clock exactly, Judge Prentice entered. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Prentice arranged himself behind the front table. This was not a formal court, but he ran it like one, and looked out at the room with the weighted gaze of a man who had been doing this for decades and had seen variations of nearly everything. We're here on the matter of a contractual claim filed by Mr. Arthur Vance of Memphis, Tennessee, against Miss Clara Whitmore, currently residing in the territory of Montana. He looked at the room over his spectacles. I have reviewed the documentation submitted by both parties this morning. Mr. Dalton, you may present Mr. Vance's claim. Dalton stood. He was smooth and prepared, and he presented the case efficiently, the contract, the language of obligation, the argument that Clara's departure constituted breach. He was careful not to use the word property. He used the phrase party of the second part. He used the phrase contractual responsibility. He used the word return in the legal sense and built a careful structure around it that was designed to sound reasonable and contain nothing that a sympathetic judge could easily object to on its face. He sat down. Prentice looked at Clara. Miss Whitmore, he said, you may respond. Clara stood. The room was very quiet. She had thought about this moment, the exact shape of it, the exact words, since the morning. She had drafted it in her head and revised it and stripped it down to what mattered most, because she knew she would not have unlimited time, and she knew that in a room like this, the person who was clearest usually prevailed. Judge Prentice, she said, the contract Mr. Dalton has presented was obtained through misrepresentation and signed by a party who did not understand what she was signing. I have provided documentation of this. I have also provided documentation of the conditions under which I lived during the period of this alleged contract, which I believe the court will find relevant to the question of whether an obligation incurred under false premises and maintained under duress can be legally enforced. She placed her first page on the table in front of Prentice. Beyond the legal argument, she said, I want to be direct about what this hearing is actually about. Mr. Vance is not here because of a contract. He is here because I left, because I chose to leave, and he has never encountered a situation in which the choice of someone he considered his to direct was not ultimately overruled. She paused. I am not his property. I am not a party of the second part in an agreement I never understood or consented to. I am a woman with a job and a place to be and every legal and moral right to be in it. Silence. Then from the row of civilian onlookers, a sound. Not quite a reaction. Something quieter. A kind of collective held breath releasing. Arthur across the room had his face very still. Dalton was writing something on his papers. Prentice looked at Clara for a long moment. Then he looked at Arthur. Mr. Vance, he said, you are present today in a personal capacity. I am your honor, Arthur said. He stood. He was still smooth, still controlled. I simply want to ensure that the obligations Miss Whitmore undertook are honored. Mr. Vance, Prentice said, and something in his tone had changed. I've been on this circuit for 8 years. I have sat in on cases involving contractual disputes and domestic arrangements, and a great many situations where the language of law was used to manage situations that the law was not designed for. He picked up one of Clara's pages. The letter you can see in my hand was written by Miss Whitmore's aunt, describing what she was told this contract contained. I would like you to read me the relevant clause of the contract you filed, specifically the clause regarding services of a personal nature. A pause. Mr. Dalton, Arthur said quietly. Dalton found the clause. He read it. Another silence. Mr. Vance, Prentice said. Your attorney described Miss Whitmore's departure as a breach of contractual obligation. I'd like to understand what specific service was obligated under this clause that she failed to provide. The silence stretched. Dalton began to speak a careful technical response, and Prentice held up one hand. I'm asking Mr. Vance, Prentice said. Arthur Vance stood in that room in front of 11 civilians and a circuit judge and a woman who had just laid out 3 years of his behavior in documented detail, and for the first time since Clara had known him, she watched him not know what to say. Not because he didn't have an answer, because every answer available to him was worse than silence. I see, Prentice said. He set the paper down. He looked at the room over his spectacles. I'm going to be clear, he said, and his voice had the weight of a man who had made a decision he was not going to revisit. This hearing is not going to result in the ruling Mr. Vance sought. The documentation before me indicates that the contract in question was obtained under circumstances that undermine its enforceability. The clause at issue, he tapped the page, describes obligations that no legal instrument in this territory or any other has the authority to compel from a free person. Miss Whitmore is a free person. She is employed. She is here voluntarily. And she will leave this room today in exactly the same condition she arrived in. Clara's hands tightened on her packet in her lap. Just slightly, just for a second. Furthermore, Prentice continued, and now there was something almost stern in his voice directed entirely at Arthur's side of the room. I am noting in the record of this hearing that the circumstances described in Miss Whitmore's personal account constitute at minimum a pattern of behavior that warrants further review by the appropriate authorities in Tennessee. I will be forwarding my observations to the relevant office. He paused. Are we clear, Your Honor? Dalton began. Are we clear? A long pause. Yes, Your Honor, Dalton said. Arthur said nothing. Prentice gathered his papers. He looked once more at Clara, not with warmth exactly, but with something that functioned like respect in a man who expressed it indirectly. Miss Whitmore, you came a long way to fight for something you should never have had to fight for. I am sorry the system made that necessary. Clara looked at him. She did not let herself cry. She had not cried in 3 years, and she was not starting in a courthouse in Harrow Falls, Montana, with 11 strangers watching. Thank you, Judge, she said. It was necessary, so I did it. Prentice nodded once. He left. The room erupted, not dramatically, not like something in a stage show, but with the particular energy of a small-town crowd that had witnessed something they would be discussing for months. People turned to each other. People stood. Somewhere behind Clara, someone said something in a low voice that she didn't hear clearly, but that sounded like it was on her side. Clara sat very still. Ethan put his hand on the table beside her hand. Not touching. Just there. She looked at his hand for one moment. Then she looked across the room. Arthur Vance was standing. He was speaking to Dalton in a voice too low to carry. His face was controlled. It was always controlled, but around his jaw there was something tight that she recognized. She had spent 3 years learning to read that tightness. She had spent 3 years understanding what it preceded. But they were not in his house, and he had just lost. He looked up and found her eyes. She held his gaze. She did not look away first. After a moment, a long moment, Arthur Vance broke the eye contact, spoke 2 more words to Dalton, and walked out of the room. Burl Hatch followed him. The sharp-faced attorney gathered his papers, and then they were gone. Pete let out a breath that seemed to have been held since approximately Memphis. Lord Almighty, he said quietly. Ethan moved his hand from the table. He looked at Clara. You all right? Yes, she said. And then because it was true and he had earned the truth, not entirely, but yes. He nodded. We have one more thing. She had not forgotten. In the aftermath of the hearing, the pressure releasing the relief threatening to undo 3 years of careful control, she had not forgotten. Glendon. Prentice is still here until tomorrow morning. I spoke with him before the hearing about the supply fraud. He said if we brought the documentation, he'd review it this afternoon. Clara picked up her packet. She pulled out the second folder. The Glendon documentation separate, organized as airtight as anything she'd ever built. She set it on the table. Then let's not waste the afternoon, she said. They found Prentice in the small office behind the hearing room, eating a sandwich with the tired efficiency of a man who had a long circuit ahead of him. He looked up when Ethan knocked. I said I'd see you, Prentice said. Sit down. Clara sat down. She opened the Glendon folder. She had expected this part to be complicated. She had expected resistance, or at least skepticism. Prentice had already done one difficult thing today, and men who did difficult things often needed to rest on the easier side of the next one. But Prentice looked at the Glendon documentation with the same careful attention he'd given her personal case, and he asked the same kind of specific, intelligent questions, and by the time she was done presenting it, she understood what Pete had said about him. He was a man who had spent 40 years in a system that didn't always let him do the right thing. When something came in front of him that was clear enough that he could, he did. This is thorough work, Prentice said, setting the last page down. Thank you, Clara said. Your bookkeeper put this together. Yes, Ethan said. Prentice looked at Clara, then back at Ethan, then back at Clara. Same woman. Same woman, Ethan confirmed. Prentice was quiet for a moment. I'll issue a formal notice to Glendon today. He'll be required to appear before the court to respond to the documented discrepancies. The Territorial Commerce Office will be notified. This, he tapped the folder, is more than enough to open a formal investigation. Thank you, Ethan said. They walked back out onto the main street of Harrow Falls. The afternoon sun was full on the mountain town now, and the people on the street were going about their ordinary business, and the day looked like any other day, and Clara stood on the wooden walkway in front of the Civic Building and felt the full weight of the morning arrive in her body all at once. She had walked into that hearing room this morning, carrying everything she had, every piece of evidence, every carefully constructed argument, 3 years of survival, and 2 years of planning, and 4 days of frantic focused work, and she had laid it all on a table in front of a man she didn't know, and she had made her case. And she had won. Not everything. Not permanently. Arthur Vance would not vanish from the world because of a hearing in a Montana courthouse. There would be more complications, more legal maneuvering, more of the patient grinding work of building a life he couldn't reach. But today she had won. She stood on the walkway and she breathed. Ethan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with the same quality of quiet presence he'd had since the first night, not filling the space, not demanding anything from it, just being there. Pete said, "I need coffee," and went to find some, which Clara was grateful for because it left her one less person to be composed for. "You did that," Ethan said quietly after a moment. "We did that," Clara said. "No." He said it gently but directly. "I stood beside you. You did that." She turned to look at him. I was looking at the street, not at her, with the same distant focus he sometimes got when he was saying something more important than he wanted to make a production of. "Ethan," she said. She had not used his first name before. She hadn't planned to use it now. It came out before she decided to say it. He looked at her. She had been very careful for a very long time about what she let herself feel, and when she let herself feel it, and especially about what she allowed to show in her face. She had learned that control because it was the only privacy she had left in Arthur's house, the inside of her own expressions. It had become habit. It had become armor. She looked at Ethan Caldwell standing beside her in the afternoon sun of a small Montana town after the morning they had just had, and she felt the armor slip. Just slightly. Just enough. "Thank you," she said, "for being here." He held her gaze for a moment that felt longer than it was. "I told you," he said. "You're not doing this alone. Down the street." Glendon's supply wagon was parked outside the general store, the man himself visible near the back, unloading a crate, unaware that a formal notice was being prepared for him at this very moment in a building 50 yards away. Clara looked at him for a moment. Ordinary. Unassuming. A man who had looked at the space left by someone's absence and decided to quietly fill his pockets. She had found him. She had documented every penny. She looked back at Ethan. "We should head back," she said. "I have work to finish." One corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough that she stored it carefully. "Of course you do." The Glendon records still need to be organized for the formal investigation. Prentice will need copies of everything I have properly indexed. Naturally. And I noticed 2 more discrepancies yesterday that I didn't have time to fully trace. I want to follow those before anyone else touches the records. Miss Whitmore. Yes. Breathe for 1 minute first, he said. She looked at him. Then quietly, privately, in a way that she didn't entirely intend and couldn't entirely prevent, she smiled. It was a small thing. Just a smile. Just her face doing something it hadn't done in a long time without thinking about whether it was safe to do it. Ethan saw it. She knew he did. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her on the trail and at the supper table, and in the records room at midnight, that steady attending look that was becoming the thing she looked for without meaning to look for it. Pete came back with 3 tin cups of coffee from the eating house and handed them around without ceremony. Clara took hers. She drank it standing in the afternoon sun on a street in Harrow Falls, Montana, with a man who had stood beside her through the hardest morning of her adult life, and she let herself have the minute he'd asked for. Just 1 minute. Then she set the cup down and picked up her packet, and they rode back up the mountain. The ride back up the mountain was quiet in the way that follows something large. Not peaceful exactly. More like the silence that comes after a storm, when the air is still charged, but the worst of it has passed, and your body is only beginning to understand that it can stop bracing. Clara rode with her packet in her lap and her eyes forward, and her mind working the way it always worked when the immediate crisis had been handled, and the longer view came back into focus. Arthur Vance had lost today. But Arthur Vance did not stay lost. She knew him well enough to know that. He was a man who recalculated rather than retreated. He would look at what had happened in that courtroom, strip it down to its components, and find another angle. He always found another angle. The only difference between today and 3 years ago was that today she had seen it coming and she had been ready. Next time she needed to be readier. She was still thinking about this when they crested the last ridge and the ranch came into view below them, and she saw the horses in the yard. 2 horses she didn't recognize. She felt Ethan go still beside her. Not a physical movement, more like a change in the quality of his attention. The way a man goes still when something his instincts know about catches up to his conscious mind a half-second later. "Pete," he said quietly. "I see them," Pete said. They rode down. Dutch was standing in the yard, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been managing a situation he was not entirely comfortable with and was profoundly relieved to see his employer arrive. "They came about an hour ago," Dutch said before Ethan even dismounted. "Said they were from the Territorial Land Office. Said they had business with the ranch." He paused. "I put them in the main house. Mrs. Greer's with them." Ethan dismounted. He handed his reins to Rabbit, who had appeared from somewhere with the eager readiness of a young man who had spent the whole day waiting for something to happen. "Did they show papers?" "Showed something. I couldn't read the whole of it. Something about a land claim." Clara dismounted. Ethan looked at her. Something moved between them. Quick, wordless, the kind of communication that happens between people who have spent intense time working together and have developed a shorthand they didn't plan. "Land claim," she said. "Yes," he said. "Glendon," she said. His jaw tightened. "Or Vance, or both." They went inside. The 2 men in the main house were not what Clara expected. She had expected lawyers, the polished, careful type like Dalton. What she found instead were 2 men in their 40s with the practical look of territorial officials, the kind who spent more time on horseback than in offices. One was tall and weathered, introduced himself as Connors. The other was shorter with a notebook already open. He didn't introduce himself immediately, just looked at the room with the assessing eye of a man whose job it was to document what he saw. Mrs. Greer was sitting in the corner with her hands folded in her lap, and an expression of composed displeasure that Clara had come to understand was her version of fury. "Mr. Caldwell," Connors said, standing. He offered his hand. Ethan shook it. "We apologize for arriving unannounced. We received a complaint this morning filed with the Territorial Land and Commerce Office regarding the northern boundary claim of this property." Ethan's voice was even. "What kind of complaint?" "A claim of disputed boundary," Connors said, "filed by a Mr. Glendon representing himself as a party with prior claim to a section of land on the north end of your property line. He filed documentation suggesting the original land grant on that section was improperly recorded." The shorter man with the notebook was already looking around the room, and Clara understood with a cold clarity that he was not here to hear Ethan's side of the story. He was here to observe and record. He was here because someone had sent him here with a specific purpose. "When was this complaint filed?" Clara said. Both men looked at her. Connors said carefully, "This morning, Miss Whitmore," she said. "I manage the records for this ranch. When was it filed?" "The paperwork is dated 8 o'clock this morning." 8 o'clock. An hour before the hearing. While Arthur's attorney was still setting up his papers and Clara was sitting across from Judge Prentice, showing him evidence of Glendon's fraud. Someone had filed a land claim at 8 in the morning, knowing that Ethan and Clara would be in Harrow Falls all day, knowing the ranch would be without its two most capable defenders, knowing that territorial officials would arrive and find only a ranch hand and a cook, and no one with the standing or the documentation to push back. They had planned both moves simultaneously. The hearing was to occupy them. The land claim was to hit them while they were occupied. Clara felt the cold clarity sharpen into something almost like admiration, the way you sometimes felt a reluctant admiration for the architecture of something that was designed to destroy you. "Mr. Connors," she said, and her voice was very calm. "I'd like to see the documentation Mr. Glendon filed." Connors looked at Ethan. "She manages the records," Ethan said simply. Connors reached into his satchel and produced the documents. Clara took them. She sat down at the table. She read. The room watched her read. She turned each page slowly. She read every word. She read the dates and the names and the legal descriptions and the notary stamps and the references to prior claims. And she felt the shape of it, assembling in her mind the same way a fraud always assembled when you knew how to look at it, the careful construction of something plausible, the places where the logic almost held, and then the places where it didn't. She found the first one on page 2. She found the second on page 4. By page 6, she had found 3 inconsistencies, and she set the papers down. "Mr. Connors," she said, "the land grant reference on page 2 document number 4471B, filed with the Territorial Office in 1879. I'd like you to look at the date on that document." Connors leaned in. He looked. "Now look at the date of the original Caldwell land grant, which is in our records here, and which I can produce for you immediately." She stood. She went to the records room. She was back in under 2 minutes with the folder she had organized 4 days ago when she first went through the full land documentation. She placed it on the table, found the relevant page, and set it beside Connors's papers. "The document Glendon references as prior claim," Clara said, "is dated March 1879. The Caldwell land grant was filed October 1878. A prior claim that is filed 5 months after the original grant is not a prior claim. It's a subsequent filing." She paused. "Additionally, the notary stamp on Glendon's document here at the bottom of page 4 is from a notary office in Billings, which is standard. But the notary identification number doesn't appear in the territorial registry for that period. I know this because I cross-referenced the notary identification numbers on our own documents last week, and I have the registry copy." She produced it. The shorter man with the notebook had stopped looking around the room. He was looking at Clara. Connors picked up the 2 documents and held them side by side. The silence in the room was the particular silence of an official who has arrived somewhere believing he understood the situation and is now understanding it differently. "Miss Whitmore," Connors said slowly, Where did you obtain the notary registry? From the records in this house, she said. The previous ranch manager kept a full set of territorial reference documents. They've been here the whole time. No one looked at them. Ethan, standing behind her, made no sound. She could feel him there the way you feel a fire in a cold room, not touching, just present, just warm. I'd like to note for your records, Clara said to the man with the notebook, who was now writing with considerably more focus than he'd had when he walked in, that this claim was filed at 8 o'clock this morning, while the principals of this ranch were at a hearing in Harrow Falls. I'd also like to note that the man who filed the claim is currently under formal review by Judge Prentice for documented supply fraud against this ranch, which review was initiated this afternoon. I would suggest that the timing and the source of this land claim are not coincidental, and I would invite the Territorial Office to take both matters under consideration together. Connors looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his shorter colleague. Then he looked at Ethan. Mr. Caldwell, he said, I think we may need to revisit the terms of why we came here today. I'd appreciate that, Ethan said. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of documentation, cross-referencing formal notation, and the kind of careful official language that Connors used to construct a record that would hold up when reviewed by people above his pay grade. Clara sat at the table and produced every document he asked for, and several he didn't know to ask for, and she answered every question directly and clearly, and did not editorialize beyond what was necessary. By the time Connors and his colleagues stood to leave, the original purpose of their visit had been entirely inverted. They had come to assess a land claim. They were leaving with documentation that would become part of a formal counter-complaint against the man who had filed it. We'll be in contact, Connors said at the door. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Miss Whitmore, you've been thorough. Thank you, she said. When the door closed, Pete let out a sound that was half laugh and half something else entirely. That, he said to the room, was something. Mrs. Greer stood up from her corner, smoothed her apron, and said, Supper in an hour, in the tone of a woman who dealt with extraordinary days by making sure ordinary things continued to happen. She went to the kitchen. Dutch sat down heavily in the chair Connors had vacated. They really thought they were going to walk in here and just... They did, Ethan said. They thought the ranch would be empty of anyone who could answer them. Instead, they got her, Rabbit said, looking at Clara with the open admiration of someone who had not yet learned to conceal it. Clara was reorganizing the documents she had spread across the table, returning everything to its proper place. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all day, through the hearing, through Arthur's presence, through Connors and his notebook, and she was faintly aware that at some point soon they were going to stop being steady. Probably when she was alone, probably in the room with the latch on the door, and she was going to feel all of this morning and afternoon arrive in her body at once. But not yet. She heard Ethan dismiss the others with a few quiet words. She heard footsteps leaving. And it was just the two of them in the main room, and the fire, and the documents on the table between them. Glendon and Vance, Ethan said. He said it the way you say something you've been thinking about since it first became possible and are now certain of. They coordinated, Clara said. The hearing and the land claim were designed to happen simultaneously, the hearing to keep us in town, the land claim to hit the ranch while we were gone. They had to have been in contact before Vance ever arrived here. Yes, which means Glendon knew about the bookkeeping review before I reported it to you. She paused. Or someone told him. The silence between them had a different quality now. Ethan sat down. He looked at the table. Dutch was quiet on the ride to town this morning, he said. Clara had noticed that too. She had filed it away without drawing conclusions. Now she took it out and looked at it. Dutch has been with the ranch for 2 years, Ethan said. It was not a defense. It was just information offered carefully. Long enough to know Glendon's schedule, Clara said. Long enough to know when supplies came in. Long enough to know that someone keeping careful books would eventually find what Glendon was doing. She was quiet. Long enough to have been told to watch for that. Ethan looked up at her. You think Dutch is... I think Dutch has been very quiet since I arrived, Clara said. I think Dutch was the one who let Glendon know I was going through the records. She met Ethan's eyes. "I think you need to talk to him." A long pause. "Yes," Ethan said. He stood up. What happened next, Clara was not present for. Ethan spoke to Dutch privately in the barn for about 20 minutes. She stayed in the main house and finished reorganizing the records and told herself she was not listening for raised voices because she trusted Ethan to handle this in the way he handled everything directly, without performance, without cruelty. She heard no raised voices. When Ethan came back inside, he looked tired. Not angry exactly. Tired in the way of a man who has had a disappointing confirmation. Dutch admitted it, Ethan said. He sat down. He put both hands flat on the table. Glendon approached him 6 months ago, told him the bookkeeping records might attract attention to some irregularities, and that Dutch would be compensated if he stayed aware of what was happening in the records room and who was handling the books. Clara set down her pen. He didn't know what Glendon was doing fully, Ethan said. He told himself it was just information, that it wasn't serious. He paused. He told me about Vance. Glendon told Dutch that a man from Memphis would be coming to make a claim on one of my workers, and that if he kept quiet and managed things on the ranch end, it would all resolve itself. The cold of it settled over Clara. He knew Arthur was coming. Yes. And he said nothing. No. Ethan's voice was very flat. Not loud. Just flat, the way a man's voice goes when the disappointment is too significant for anything more expressive. He said nothing. Clara sat with this. She thought about Dutch, who had nodded at her when she arrived and been quiet ever since. She thought about the way small betrayals worked, how they were almost never dramatic, almost never motivated by the kind of grand malice that made sense of them. They were motivated by money and by the human tendency to tell yourself that what you were doing wasn't really what you were doing. "What are you going to do?" she said. "I'm going to let him go," Ethan said. "In the morning. He'll ride out with a month's pay and I won't involve the authorities unless he forces me to." He looked at the table. "He's got a family in Bozeman. The money Glendon paid him probably went to them." He was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't change what he did. But I'm not going to ruin a man's family over a mistake he made out of desperation." Clara looked at him. She had not expected this. She had expected Ethan to be harder about it. He had every right to be harder about it. But she looked at him sitting there with his hands flat on the table and the tiredness of the day in his face, and she understood that this was the same man who had seen a woman standing alone on a porch in a mountain town and offered her supper without asking what she'd done to deserve it. "That's," she started, stopped. "That's a generous judgment." "It's not generous," Ethan said. "It's just the one I can live with." She nodded slowly. They sat in the quiet of the main room. Outside, the mountain evening was coming in that particular Montana dusk that arrived purple and enormous and made everything smaller underneath it. Mrs. Greer was making sounds in the kitchen. Rabbit was doing something in the yard that involved dropping a bucket and retrieving it based on the sounds. Pete was presumably somewhere being Pete, solid and uncomplicated and reliable in a way that Clara had come to feel was one of the genuine gifts of this place. "There's something else," Ethan said. She looked at him. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the table and slid it toward her. She picked it up. She unfolded it. It was a letter, addressed to Ethan, written in a hand she didn't recognize, dated 3 days ago, the day before Arthur arrived. She read it. Her hands went very still. The letter was from a woman named Margaret Holt in Billings. She described herself as a former resident of Memphis. She wrote that she had heard through a mutual acquaintance that a Clara Whitmore had left Arthur Vance's household and traveled west. She wrote that she wanted Ethan, whoever he was, whatever his connection to Clara, to know that Clara was not the first. There had been at least 2 other women before Clara. One had been bought out. Margaret used that phrase. Bought out, with a precise and devastating directness, with a sum of money that effectively silenced her. The other had been returned to her family under legal pressure and had not been heard from since. Arthur Vance had done this before. He had refined it. He had a method. Clara set the letter down on the table. She looked at the wall. She was aware of a feeling moving through her that she didn't have a name for. Not quite grief. not quite rage. Something that was the combination of them. The grief of recognizing that what had happened to her was not singular, was not even unusual, and the rage that came from understanding the scale of what a man could do when the systems around him were either complicit or simply not paying attention. "When did this arrive?" she said. Her voice was even. She had decided it would be even. "The day before Vance showed up," Ethan said. "I didn't tell you then because we had enough to manage and I didn't want it to—" He stopped. "I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry." "You were protecting me from information," Clara said. She said it carefully because she was aware it could come out as an accusation, and she did not entirely intend it as one. She was more interested in being accurate than in being angry. "Yes," Ethan said. "And I'm not sure that was the right call." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the direct, honest attention that she had come to think of as his particular form of courage. The courage of a man who did not look away when he had done something he wasn't entirely certain about. "It wasn't," she said. "I needed to know this before the hearing. It changes the weight of the argument." "I know, I'm sorry. But—" She paused. She picked up the letter again. She looked at it. "But it doesn't change what happened today. And it gives me something I didn't have before." "Another witness," Ethan said. "A pattern," Clara said. Prentice said he would forward his observations to the relevant authorities in Tennessee. "If Margaret Holt is willing to speak if the other woman can be found. This stops being one woman's account against a prominent man's denial. This becomes a documented pattern." She folded the letter. She held it. "This is what changes everything." The fire cracked. Ethan looked at her. "You're already thinking about the next step," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite wonder and not quite amusement, but was in the vicinity of both. "I'm always thinking about the next step," Clara said. "It's how I survived the last 3 years." A pause. "Clara," he said. "Not Miss Whitmore." Clara. He had never used her first name before. She looked at him. "You don't have to just survive anymore," he said. She held his gaze. The room was quiet. The fire was going. Somewhere outside, Rabbit dropped the bucket again. The sounds of the ranch moved around them like water moving around 2 rocks in a stream around them, not past them because they were still here, both of them still in this room, still at this table. She did not know how to answer what he had said, because what he had said was true, in a way she wasn't ready to hold all of yet. She had been surviving for so long that she wasn't sure she had fully imagined what the alternative looked like. She had been moving toward it 4 days. On this ranch had felt more like living than the last 3 years, but the complete picture of it was still something she was assembling at the edges, the way you build a fire in the dark, one piece at a time. "I know," she said. "And then, I'm learning." He nodded. Mrs. Greer called them for supper. They went. The table that night was different. Dutch's absence was noticed, but not remarked on the ranch, had a way of absorbing changes, without dramatizing them, that Clara had come to appreciate. Pete poured coffee for everyone, with the equanimity of a man who had seen enough of life to know that some days were hard, and supper still happened. Rabbit ate twice as much as usual, which seemed to be his response to emotional stress. Sam talked about the stone-bruised horse, which was apparently recovering satisfactorily. Mrs. Greer put a pie on the table for no reason, she stated, which Clara understood meant she was proud of something and wasn't going to say so. Clara ate. She sat at the table in this house she had been in for 5 days, and she ate supper with these people, and she felt not the fragile, tentative safety of the first night when she had sat by the fire and not quite trusted what she was feeling. She felt something more solid. Something that had been built over 5 days of work and documentation, and court hearings, and land claims, and a conversation at a table after dark. And it was not finished being built. She knew it was not finished, but it was real. It had the weight of real things. She looked at Ethan across the table. He was listening to something Pete was saying about the north fence line, and he had that particular look of focused, patient attention. He gave to practical matters, and he was exactly himself, not performing anything, not managing anyone, just being the man he was in the house he'd built in the mountains he'd chosen. He felt her looking. He glanced up, just for a moment. Clara looked back down at her plate, but she was smiling, quietly, privately. In a way, she didn't try to stop. After supper, she went back to the records room. She had two things to do before she slept: write a letter to Margaret Holt in Billings, and begin the formal summary document for the Territorial Office that would combine the Glendon fraud case and the land claim into a single coherent narrative. She lit the lamp. She set out paper. She dipped her pen. She had been working for about 20 minutes when she heard footsteps in the hall. Ethan appeared in the doorway. "You're working," he said. "I am." "It's 9 o'clock." "It is." He leaned against the doorframe. He looked at the papers spread across the table. He looked at her sitting at the center of them, pen in hand, completely in her element. "Margaret Holt," he said. "Yes, and the summary for the Territorial Office." "That can wait until morning." "The letter to Margaret Holt cannot," Clara said. "She reached out through a third party to a man she didn't know because she believed I needed to know what she knew. She took a risk to help me. The least I can do is respond promptly and tell her that her information has already been used and that I would like her help to use it further." Ethan was quiet. "Okay," he said. "The territorial summary I can do in the morning," she allowed. He nodded. He stayed in the doorway. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said. She looked up. "Ask?" "Why Montana?" He paused. "There are other places you could have gone. Cities. Places with more infrastructure for a woman trying to start again. Why a mountain ranch in Montana?" Clara set her pen down. She thought about this. Not about the answer which she knew, but about whether to give it. About how much of herself to offer to a question that deserved an honest answer. "I grew up in cities," she said. "I spent 3 years in a house where I could feel the walls. I needed somewhere where the walls were far away." She paused. "And I was good at books, numbers, organization. I knew the kind of work I could do. I found the advertisement for a bookkeeper position on a mountain ranch and I thought—" She stopped. "What?" he said. "I thought no one looks for a runaway woman on a mountain," she said. "I thought I'd be safe there long enough to figure out what came next." Ethan looked at her. "And," he said. She picked her pen back up. She looked at the letter she was writing. "And it turned out to be more than that," she said. She did not look up when she said it. "It turned out to be considerably more than that." The silence between them had the quality of something that was being handled carefully by both of them simultaneously. "Good night, Clara," he said. "Good night, Ethan," she said. She heard him walk back down the hall. She dipped her pen. She finished the letter to Margaret Holt. She described what had happened. She described what she needed. She described briefly and precisely what the pattern of Arthur Vance's behavior had cost them both, and she said that she intended to make sure it could not be repeated, and she asked Margaret if she was willing to be part of making that true. She sealed the letter. She organized her papers. She sat for one moment in the lit room at the table she had claimed as her working space in the house she had been in for 5 days. On the ranch, she had come to as a stranger with a suitcase and a letter and a calculation about survival. She looked at what was on the table. Documentation. Evidence. The careful, thorough architecture of truth made visible. And somewhere in the stack underneath the territorial forms and the Glendon invoices and the land grant records, the small leather notebook she carried everywhere, the one she wrote in when she needed to think. She pulled it out. She opened to a blank page. She wrote 3 words. She looked at them. "I am here." 3 words. The simplest thing she could say. The truest thing she had said in years. She closed the notebook. She turned down the lamp. She went to bed. And outside the ranch breathed around her in the mountain dark. The horses in the corral, the fire settling in the hearth, the vast Montana sky pressing down on the valley with its impossible weight of stars, and Clara Whitmore, who had arrived here with nothing and was leaving that nothing further behind with every day that passed, slept without dreams, in a room with a latch on the door. In the morning, everything would continue. There was more to do. There was always more to do. The territorial summary, and Margaret Holt's response, and the formal Glendon investigation, and whatever Arthur Vance was going to try next, because he was going to try something she knew that, and she was going to be ready for it, and she was not going to be ready alone. But tonight she slept. And that was enough. Margaret Holt's letter arrived 9 days later. Clara was in the records room when Rabbit brought it in, slightly out of breath from riding up from town faster than necessary, because Rabbit had adopted the delivery of Clara's mail as a personal mission of importance. She took the envelope from him, noted the Billings postmark, and set it on the table beside her pen. She finished the invoice calculation she was working on first. Then she opened it. Margaret Holt wrote the way a woman wrote when she had been holding something for a long time and had finally found someone to hand it to, with a careful, almost formal precision that Clara recognized as the writing style of a person who had learned that emotion without structure was too easily dismissed. The letter was 4 pages. It was specific. It named dates and amounts and the name of the attorney who had delivered the buyout offer, and the precise language used to explain why Margaret's silence was in everyone's best interest. It was in short exactly what Clara had hoped for, and more than she had let herself expect. She read it twice. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed. 9 days had passed since the hearing. 9 days since Arthur Vance walked out of that room in Harrow Falls, and Clara had watched him go. 9 days during which she had done what she always did when she had survived something. She had gone back to work. The territorial summary for the Glendon fraud had gone to the office in Billings. The formal counter-complaint against the land claim had been filed with Connors's assistance. The investigation was moving slowly. The way territorial proceedings moved with the grinding patience of a system that operated on paper and horseback, but it was moving. Arthur had not reappeared. She had been waiting for him to reappear. She had gone about her days with one part of her attention always angled toward that possibility, toward the sound of unfamiliar horses in the yard, toward letters with Memphis postmarks, toward the particular quality of quiet that preceded something. She had not let herself fully relax. She had not let herself believe it was over. But 9 days had passed, and now she had Margaret Holt's letter. She stood up. She went to find Ethan. He was at the corral with Sam, looking at the horse with the stone bruise, which had apparently staged a full recovery, judging by the way it was moving. He heard her coming and turned before she reached him, which she had noticed he always did. That particular awareness of his surroundings that came from years of living in mountain country, where awareness was not a luxury. She handed him the letter without preamble. He read it. She watched his face as he read it. She had become good at reading his face, not perfectly, not completely, but better than she'd been a week ago. She could see when something landed with him, when something shifted behind his eyes. Something shifted now. "She'll testify," he said without looking up from the page. "She'll provide a written affidavit," Clara said. "She's not ready to travel yet. She has a daughter under 2 years old, but she will put everything she's told me in writing, signed and notarized, and she says she knows the name of the other woman, the one who was returned to her family." Ethan looked up. "If we can reach her," Clara said, "and if she's willing, we have 3 accounts. 3 documented instances of the same pattern from the same man. That is not one woman's word against a prominent man's reputation. That is a case." Ethan handed the letter back. He looked at her with that steady measuring attention that never quite felt like scrutiny, more like someone making sure they were seeing clearly. "You've been planning this for 9 days, he said. "I've been planning this since Memphis," Clara said. "I just didn't have all the pieces yet." Sam, who was pretending to be entirely focused on the recovered horse, was clearly listening to every word. Clara didn't mind. The people on this ranch had stopped being strangers somewhere around day 4. She wasn't sure exactly when it had happened. It had happened the way most real things happened, gradually, and then all at once. "I need to write to the Tennessee State Legal Office," Clara said. "And I need a contact at the federal level, someone above the state, someone who handles cases involving documented patterns of coercion across state lines. Do you know anyone in that position, or know someone who does?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Judge Prentice might," he said. "Prentice," Clara repeated. She had thought about Prentice. She had revised her opinion of him several times since the hearing, upward mostly. He was not a simple man. He was a man who had been doing a complicated job for a long time, and on the day she had needed him to do the right thing, he had done it. "Do you think he'd be willing to make a connection?" I think if you write him a letter explaining what you have and what you need, he'll read it, Ethan said. Whether he acts on it depends on what you say. Then I'll make sure what I say is worth acting on. She went back to the records room. She had 4 letters to write. She wrote them all before supper. What she did not anticipate was that the answer to one of them would arrive before she had fully stopped expecting the worst. The second letter she had written that afternoon was not to Prentice and not to the Tennessee legal office. It was to her aunt, Mrs. Ruth Langley of Nashville, who had signed a document she didn't understand because a lawyer she didn't know had told her it was standard, and who had watched her niece marry Arthur Vance with the genuine conviction that she was watching Clara's future be secured. Clara had not written to her aunt since Memphis. She had been too angry. Not the hot, immediate kind of anger, the cold, sustained kind that lives in the chest like a stone and takes a long time to pass, because it is not really about the person you're angry at, but about the situation, and the situation had not resolved. Some of it had resolved now. Not all of it, but some. She wrote to her aunt carefully and honestly. She explained what had happened. She explained what the contract had actually been. She explained what her life in Arthur's house had looked like from the inside, which she had never told her aunt, because she had not believed her aunt would be believed, and now that belief had shifted just enough to make the truth possible. She told her aunt what she had done, where she was, what she was building. She did not ask for anything. She just told the truth. She sealed that letter last, and she sat with it in her hand for a moment, and she felt the stone in her chest shift, just slightly, just enough. She put it with the others. She went to supper. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Glendon investigation produced its first formal result. Glendon appeared before a territorial magistrate in Billings and was found to have engaged in systematic invoice fraud against 3 separate ranches in the territory. Ethan's was the largest documented case, and it was also, the magistrate noted, the most thoroughly documented, the kind of observation that made Pete make a sound under his breath that was not quite a laugh but served the same purpose. The restitution order was issued. Clara was sitting at the records room table when Ethan came in and told her. She set down her pen. She looked at the table. She looked at the number he handed her on a slip of paper. The total restitution, which was larger than the amount she had initially estimated, because the formal investigation had found the same pattern in 2 other sets of records she hadn't had access to. That's, she started. A significant amount, Ethan said. Yes. Because of what you found. Because it was there to be found, Clara said. Clara. She looked up. You found it, he said. Simply, completely. Without any of the qualifications she sometimes still expected from men who were acknowledging something that inconvenienced their version of the story. It was there. You found it. Those are both true, and the second one matters. She looked at him for a moment. All right, she said. Yes, I found it. Good, he said. He put the slip of paper on the table in front of her. He started to leave. Ethan, she said. He stopped. Sit down, she said. I want to talk to you about something. He sat. She had been thinking about this for 2 weeks. She had thought about the right moment, the right words, the right way to say a thing that mattered without making it seem like more than it was or less than it was. She had drafted it in her head 3 times and scrapped it twice. She was going to do it plainly. When you hired me, she said, you offered me a position managing your records. The salary we agreed on was appropriate for that position. Yes, Ethan said, watching her. What I have actually been doing for the past 3 weeks is considerably more than managing your records. She folded her hands on the table. I have conducted a fraud investigation. I have appeared at a legal hearing. I have documented and filed a counter-complaint against a false land claim. I have coordinated with a territorial magistrate and 2 territorial officials. I have been building a case that will affect the legal standing of this ranch for years. She paused. I am not saying this to complain. I am saying it because I want to renegotiate our agreement. Ethan looked at her. She kept going. I would like a formal position as ranch business manager, not bookkeeper business manager, with a salary that reflects the full scope of what that means. I would also like a written agreement that specifies my role, my authority within that role, and the terms under which either of us could end the arrangement. She met his eyes. I am not going to live in a situation again where the terms of my being somewhere are informal and therefore vulnerable. I need it in writing. The silence stretched for a moment. Then Ethan said, "You're right." She blinked. She had prepared for negotiation. She had prepared for pushback. She had not quite prepared for immediate agreement. "The salary you're proposing," he said. She told him. He didn't flinch. "That's fair." "The written agreement." "I'll have Pete witness it," he said. "We can draft it this week." She looked at him. "You seem surprised," he said, and there was the not quite smile again, that slight movement at the corner of his mouth that she had catalogued somewhere in the vicinity of her heart, whether she had intended to or not. "I'm not surprised," she said. She stopped. "I'm not used to it being that straightforward." "Most things are," Ethan said, "when both people are dealing honestly." She looked at the table. She looked at the slip of paper with the restitution number. She thought about the drafting of the written agreement, the formal title, the specified terms. The thing that could not be undone in the dark while she wasn't looking. "Thank you," she said. "Thank yourself," he said. "You negotiated it." He stood up. He was almost at the door when she said, "Ethan, one more thing." He turned. "I got a letter from my aunt this morning," she said. "I haven't told you yet." Something moved in his expression. He came back and sat down. She produced the letter. It had arrived with the morning post, and she had read it twice before breakfast, and then put it in her pocket and carried it through the whole day, taking it out periodically to make sure it still said what she thought it said. "She's sorry," Clara said. "That's most of it. She's sorry, and she wants me to know that if she had understood, she keeps saying that if she had understood, she would not have." Clara stopped. She picked up the letter and set it down again. "She wants to come here. She wants to see me." "What do you want?" Ethan said. Clara looked at the window. The mountain evening was coming in. She could see the last light on the peaks through the glass, that particular amber that lasted only a few minutes before the purple came. "I want to see her," she said. "I want to see her and look at her face when she tells me she's sorry and decide for myself if it's real." She paused. "I haven't had family in a long time." "No," Ethan said quietly. I've gotten very good at not needing it," she said. "I've gotten very good at being sufficient to myself. That was necessary. It kept me alive." She folded her hands. "But I don't think sufficient to yourself is supposed to be the final destination. I think it's supposed to be something you learn so that when you do let people in, you choose them instead of just accepting whoever's there." Ethan was looking at her with that complete, still attention. "I think you've always known that," he said. "I think I forgot it for a while," she said. "I'm remembering." They sat in the quiet of the records room and let the evening come in through the window, and Clara thought about the letter in her pocket, and the written agreement they were going to draft, and the 4 letters she had sent today, and the case that was building in Tennessee and Montana simultaneously, and the 9 days of waiting that had turned into something more solid than she had dared to plan for. She thought about what it meant to choose something instead of just surviving it. The answer to Margaret Holt's letter came on a Tuesday 4 weeks after the hearing. Not from Margaret Holt. From the other woman. Her name was Louise Carey, and she was living in Cheyenne now, and she had heard from Margaret that someone was building a case, and her letter was 3 sentences long. The first sentence said she remembered everything. The second sentence said she had been afraid for 4 years. The third sentence said she was not afraid anymore. Clara read those 3 sentences at the records room table, and she set the letter down very carefully, and she pressed both hands flat on the surface, and she breathed through the feeling that was moving through her chest, which was not grief, and not triumph, and not relief, but some combination of all 3 that didn't have a name and didn't need one. She picked up her pen. She wrote back to Louise Carey the same day. What happened next happened faster than Clara had expected. Prentice had responded to her letter with a name, a federal contact in the Department of Justice, who had been building a broader inquiry into patterns of coercive legal instruments used against women in the Western Territories. When Clara wrote to this contact with her documentation and the names of Margaret Holt and Louise Carey, the response was prompt and serious. There was more than she knew about. There were other cases. What she had assembled was one piece of a larger picture that people in positions to act had been trying to complete for 2 years. She became part of completing it. This is what that looked like. Practically letters, documentation, careful and thorough, written accounts of specific incidents, cross-referenced with dates and legal instruments, all of it organized into the kind of case file that a federal inquiry could use. It was unglamorous. It was painstaking. It required the same skills she had been using since she arrived at the ranch, the ability to look at a body of information and find the pattern, to make the invisible legible, to build something out of details that other people had dismissed as insignificant because they were looking at each piece individually instead of seeing what they built together. She had always been able to do this. She had just never before been in a place where she was allowed to do it for something that mattered this much. Ethan, during this period, did something she came to understand was characteristic of him. He did not get involved unless she asked him to. He did not offer opinions on what she should or shouldn't include, or how she should structure her arguments. He made sure she had what she needed: ink, paper, lamp oil, the particular quiet of the records room in the evenings when the rest of the ranch had settled. He brought her coffee at 8 o'clock without being asked, because he had noticed she needed it at 8 o'clock. He read the documents she showed him and offered specific, useful observations and nothing else. One evening about 5 weeks after the hearing, he came into the records room at 8 o'clock with the coffee and found her sitting back in her chair with her hands in her lap and the look of someone who has been running hard for a long time and has just realized the ground has leveled. He set the coffee down. He sat across from her. "It's done," he said. "The file goes to Washington day after tomorrow," she said. "Prentice is forwarding it with his recommendation. The federal contact says we have enough. Enough to open a formal federal inquiry into Arthur Vance's conduct over the past decade. Enough that his attorneys will advise him to settle. Enough that whatever settlement he offers will come with conditions that make it impossible for him to do this again without immediate consequence." Ethan was quiet. "He won't go to prison," Clara said. She said it without bitterness. She had made her peace with this possibility weeks ago, because she had understood from the beginning that the system moved toward accountability in a sideways manner, and that men like Arthur rarely ended up in the specific place they deserved. He's too careful for prison, but his reputation will not survive an inquiry. His social position, his business relationships, his standing in Memphis, all of that depends on the performance of a certain kind of respectability. The inquiry ends that performance. That matters, Ethan said. Yes, Clara said. It matters. Not perfectly, but enough. She picked up the coffee cup. She wrapped both hands around it. She looked at the lamp and the papers and the familiar surface of the records room table, and she felt the shape of the past 5 weeks settle around her like something being laid down after a long carry. "Clara," Ethan said. She looked at him. He had his hands on the table, and he was looking at her with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was entirely honest, that was just him being present and real and saying what he meant without performing any version of it. "What do you want?" he said. "Not for the case, not for the inquiry. What do you want for yourself now that the hardest part of this is done?" She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about this question seriously because it deserved seriousness. She thought about what she had wanted at the beginning, safety work walls that were far away. She thought about what she had built in 5 weeks that she hadn't been planning to build. She thought about the written agreement that Pete had witnessed and which was now in the ranch's files, making her role here formal and protected in the way she had insisted it needed to be. She thought about the letter from her aunt and the visit they had agreed on, and the idea of family that was still fragile and new in her hands, but was hers to decide what to do with. She thought about the table at supper every night, and the coffee at 8, and the man sitting across from her, who had never once looked at her like she was a problem to be solved, or an object to be managed, or a woman to be handled, who had looked at her from the very first night like she was a person. "I want to stay here," she said. Ethan held her gaze. "I want the work," she said, "and the written agreement, and the title and the salary, and I want all of that to be mine in a way that nothing can take back. But I also—" She stopped. She made herself continue because she had come too far to stop now at the thing that actually mattered. "I also want to see where this goes, whatever this is, between you and me." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not asking you to tell me what it is or what it becomes. I'm telling you that I want to find out if you do." The room was very quiet. Ethan looked at her across the table. The fire in the hearth down the hallway cracked and settled. Outside, the mountain night was full and dark and enormous. Somewhere in the corral, a horse moved. "I've been alone a long time," Ethan said. He said it the way he said difficult things plainly, without decoration. "I got used to it. I told myself I'd gotten good at it." He looked at his hands on the table. "Then you arrived with one suitcase and a packet of documents, and you reorganized my entire understanding of what my records room was for, and—" He stopped. Something moved in his expression that was the nearest she had ever seen him come to being undone by something. "I don't know what this is either. But I know that this house is different with you in it. I know that I'm different. And I know that I would like to find out what that means." He met her eyes. "If you want to." Clara looked at him. She thought about the first night. The fire and the tin plate and the beans and cornbread and the sky full of stars. She thought about what he had offered her then, not rescue, not charity, not a cage with better furniture. Just supper. Just a seat at the table. Just the simple radical act of treating her like a person who was cold and hungry and deserved to be warm and fed. She thought about what she had learned in the weeks since that love. Real love did not announce itself in grand gestures. It announced itself in coffee at 8 o'clock, and a man who stepped between her and a threat without being asked, and the words, "You're not doing this alone," said to someone who had been doing everything alone for so long that she had nearly forgotten what alone meant. "I want to," she said. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his hand, large and weathered and work-worn, covering hers where it rested on the table. She turned her hand over. She held his. They sat like that in the lamplight of the records room with the mountain night outside, and the fire down the hall, and the papers all around them, all that evidence of what she had fought for, and what she had built. And it was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that looked like anything from the outside. It was just two people at a table in a house in the mountains, choosing each other in the quiet way of people who had both learned that the quiet choice was the truest one. Her aunt came in September. She came on a Tuesday, arriving by wagon from Harrow Falls, with a small trunk and an expression of careful uncertainty that Clara recognized as the look of a woman who is not sure of her welcome and is too proud to show how much she wants it. Clara met her in the yard. She looked at her aunt, older, thinner, with the particular worn quality of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time, and she felt the last of the stone in her chest shift and dissolve. She did not say, "I forgive you." She said, "Come in. We're about to have supper." Her aunt looked at her. Her eyes went bright. She pressed her lips together, and she nodded, and she came inside. At the supper table that evening, there were 7 people. Clara, Ethan, Pete Rabbit, Sam, Mrs. Greer, and Ruth Langley. Mrs. Greer had made a roast. There was bread, and there was coffee, and there was the particular kind of noise that a table makes when it has the right number of people around it. Clara sat between Ethan and her aunt. She passed the bread to her left and the coffee to her right, and she listened to Pete making her aunt laugh with a story about a horse that had opinions about river crossings, and she felt the warmth of the room settle into her, like something she had been standing outside of for a long time and had finally walked through the door of. Ethan beside her said nothing. But at some point during the meal, his hand found hers under the table. She held it. Later, much later, when the house was quiet and the fire had burned low and her aunt was asleep in the room next to hers, and Ethan had gone out for his last check of the corral, and the night was enormous and still around the ranch, Clara stood on the porch in the dark and looked at the mountains. She had arrived here 5 weeks ago with a suitcase and a coin and broken boots and the particular exhausted determination of a woman who has decided she is not going to stop no matter what. She had arrived not knowing if she would last a week, not knowing if the job was real or the ranch was real, or any of the things she was moving toward were real. She knew now. The job was real. The ranch was real. The written agreement with her name on it as business manager was real. The case file that had gone to Washington was real. Margaret Holt and Louise Carey and the 3 sentences that said, "I am not afraid anymore," were real. The man who had just come back from the corral and was now standing beside her on the porch without saying anything, because he knew when she needed the quiet and when she needed the company, and had somehow from very early on known the difference, he was real. She felt his presence beside her. She leaned slightly without planning to until her shoulder was against his arm. He didn't move away. He put his arm around her shoulders slowly and without fuss, the way he did everything. She looked at the mountains in the dark. She thought about the first night, the fire, the tin plate. "Eat supper," he had said. She had thought he was offering her food. He was offering her this house, this work, this table where she had a seat that nobody could take from her because she had built it herself piece by piece, document by document, choice by choice. This man beside her, who had learned that letting someone in was not weakness, who had learned it because she had given him the same thing he gave her, the chance to be seen clearly and chosen anyway. She was not rescued. She was not saved. She was home, and she had chosen every inch of it. Clara Whitmore, who had arrived with nothing, stood in the dark of the Montana mountains and felt the full weight of what she had built settle around her like something she had always been walking toward without knowing what it would look like when she got there. She knew now. This was it. This was enough. This was everything.